Hello, everybody, and welcome to The Bone Clocks chat by David Mitchell. I am joined by Jimmy Nuts from the Fantasy Network and Joanna from Joanna Reads to discuss this very weird book. A strange book for sure. Very endearing in certain ways, very odd to me, at least in certain ways. But this book came about to me because Jimmy recommended it to me. And then Joanna, I kind of asked her if she wanted to buddy read it with me, which she graciously agreed to. And then we wrangled Jimmy in for our conversation. So that's how we got here. So if that's not a perfect summary, I don't know what is. But before we start, how is everybody?
I'm good. Very good. I am happy I'm talking about David Mitchell. I don't think I've ever seen a David Mitchell discussion in our corner of BookTube. So
I don't either. So after I finished reading the book, I hopped on to YouTube and looked up the bone clocks. And the most recent stuff had been about 4 to 9 years
yeah.
for this book. So I was like, okay, we're dealing in a little bit of a desert here in terms of content. But
Yeah,
Joanna, how are you?
I'm doing good, thank you. Yeah, the closest I've seen was I was watching Talking Stories channel. He was on my channel this last weekend for Why Read, and I
Yep.
meant to ask him about this because I totally forgot. But he mentioned David Mitchell as one of his auto-buy authors, and I commented at the time that I was reading The Bone Clocks. I got the impression from him that maybe The Bone Clocks isn't quite the place he would start with David Mitchell, though he loved the Bone Clocks. And
Yeah.
because I guess from what I understand, I'm not totally sure, I need to ask him. It sounds like there might be some sort of connection between
Mhm.
this book and some of his other books like Cloud Atlas. That's
All of
accurate,
them.
Jimmy? All of
Well,
them.
I
Oh,
maybe
wow.
maybe not all, but he has like almost a connected universe in some ways.
Yeah.
People pop up. There's mentions. There's also like reappearances of characters. There's in-world texts that are mentioned that someone wrote and then someone mentions in a different book. And I was reading a thing today. I think it was Guardian or maybe it was The Atlantic. And they were saying that, Mitchell has kind of looked at this as whenever he's done, it's like one big book.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Spanning over different time periods with different people and a lot of the undercurrents of things that are pushing things into certain directions, I think actually reappear. And like they're kind of moving in a lot of different places in a lot of these books. And then, of course, there's Slade House, which I was told basically is like a companion book to Bone Clocks. It's happening like congruently.
Oh,
And it's
interesting.
like 300 pages and I loved it. I thought it was like kind of creepy and also kind of funny because that's what he does. But Slade House, a lot of people say like you definitely want to read it after Bone Clocks because it gives Bone Clocks more context, which is cool and informs a lot of the things that you see in Slade House. So yeah, he's super ambitious, clearly.
Yeah.
This is a guy who also started tweeting a book and people are like, did he just invent a new form of fiction? Like
Is he
he
the guy
was,
that did that? Was that
yeah,
him? I didn't
yeah,
realize that was him. Okay, that's interesting.
I didn't know
yeah. He
about
was
that.
basically, writing a novella at 140 characters at a time.
Yeah.
And people were like, wait, what? And then I heard that he had removed it and people are speculating that it might be a part of his next book or a new book, possibly, because
Interesting.
he always starts them out as like POVs and short stories and novellas. And then they start to, kind of intertwine and then he makes a package and then pushes it out. So just
Yeah.
a strange guy, honestly, and very respected within the literary community. And I think he is popular, by the way, but like not in the fantasy place,
Yeah.
right? I don't think David
Yeah.
Mitchell readers are probably on BookTube. I don't think like
Probably
his
not.
core
That
audience.
was the vibe I got. So I think when you recommended it to me, you were just finishing Slade House or had just finished it. And you were like, I think you might like it because it's weird because I was going on about the fact that I like weird books. And then when we read it, like I said, I jumped onto YouTube afterwards. And then I also jumped into Reddit because there was just nothing on YouTube that was current. And so I thought maybe Reddit because the fantasy Reddit, if you're in there, is so massive. And I was like, someone's had to have said something about this book. And even still, it was several years since any kind of current conversation about this book. But the general opinion for the most part was that David Mitchell is really well liked. And I see a lot of people saying Cloud Atlas, like that seems to be a
Yeah.
lot of people's jumping in point with him or what he's most famous for. But it was similar to what you said, Joanna, where a lot of people were saying shared universe, but maybe don't start with the bone clocks, because in the few old threads that I went through, people were saying, I I don't really get what's going on here, which was very much my reading experience for a good chunk of the book. And they were like, it's because you probably shouldn't have started with the bone clocks. You definitely can, but it might make more sense if you start here instead. So it's kind of interesting that there is another author with this kind of shared universe. I mean, like, I think when we talk about shared universes more than anybody, we obviously talk about Sanderson, but it seems like there are these other authors that do this too, and we just kind of don't give it the same
Well, like
level of
Stephen King.
recognition. Yeah,
Stephen King does
exactly,
that
right?
with the Dark Tower series and several
Mhm.
of his other works.
Moorcock
Sure.
and then
Moorcock.
Asimov. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
so definitely interesting for sure. But if you guys were to give a non-spoilery synopsis of this book, how would you go about describing this book?
well, you start off with a teenager who's a little angsty and rebellious, and you probably are wondering what you got yourself into. And then all of a sudden, you're spanning different time periods, not just in the past and present, but also into the future. And it covers what, six, I think, different POVs from a first person perspective. Each has its very own unique voice, which I absolutely love. And essentially, you see the little connections in life and the way people cross paths. A little bit of a butterfly effect, but not to a really
Yeah.
dramatic level, I would say. Reappearances, references, and it's just like those little interactions can change the course of someone's entire life and put them in a different place while the world is still like moving forward. So like there's this greater idea that humanity's moving forward, and then you're seeing these interpersonal relationships or connections or brief pass-bys that are also all having to deal with something more magical under the surface, which happens to deal with kind of being preyed upon and used possibly. And the bone clocks is is a derogatory term actually in the book for humans. So that should give you some idea there. Gnosticism, I think, is explored a decent bit here. And that's kind of it. It sounds really strange, but it's really just vignettes and novellas pieced together over this
Mhm.
Yeah.
insane amount of time.
That's
Yeah.
perfectly said. I love the
Yeah.
way that this starts out following a young teenage character in 1984, a 14-year-old girl, and yet her life has repercussions for four different people, five different people, really, over the course of the story over several decades. And yet each person plays a part in this story as well. So I think it's beautiful. I know, Laura, you keep saying it's weird. I mean, I could see that there were weird elements with some of the esoteric stuff that's happening in the story, but what I found so powerful was it was such a there was so much humanity in it. There was so much in-depth character work, and I just think that Mitchell is gifted with the way he writes about character because
Mhm.
not only do you have these very distinct characters, yes, but they each are and not only adding to the story and to the magical elements overall, but each person is perfectly an individual in their own right, and yet still informed by their time, by their culture, by their location, by their socioeconomic status, the by their social media or not social media, but the social culture of their time
Mhm.
and or pop culture of their time. And I loved that. I loved all the details that went into that. As a music person,
Mhm.
I just lived for all of the references to things from Bellini's Casta Diva to John Cage to Pink Floyd. I mean, is so much that's referred to Talking Heads.
Did you
Yeah.
listen to the track list after you finished the book?
Just some of them. Yeah.
Yeah, in the back of the book,
Actually,
he says the
yeah.
songs that were on his iPod when he
Mhm.
wrote. I thought that
I
was something that you specifically would
I
love,
love that.
Joanna.
I got
Yeah.
lit
That's a
up.
total Joannaism, yeah.
I
Yeah.
got lit up. I actually we have a in our fireside Discord, we have a music section in there, and I actually posted a couple of songs from the book, and I was
Yeah.
like, I was very excited about because I love Casta Diva from oh man, I'm blanking on her name. Ah, famous opera singer. I'm gonna have to look it up again because I feel
I'm not
stupid.
the one to know.
Well, I know her voice very
If
well,
you
and
want
I
a
know
grunge or rap reference, I'm your girl.
Maria
I'll run
Callas.
the
Maria Callas.
line.
Maria Callas
Maria
is
Callas.
Pasta Diva,
Okay.
which is a very powerful piece. And then there was another piece that you referred to that I knew of and I hadn't listened to in a while. I don't know, but just it was just fantastic. It was wonderful. I love that. I love that there's a playlist at the back. There are even some questions at the back,
Yeah,
like
there's a book club guide, and it's really
yeah.
interesting, and I think it shows you how much there is to this book. I know one of the questions is this a political book? And I read that
Mm.
question and I was like,
It
"No."
is. I think it is.
But yeah, no, then I thought about it
Yeah.
more and I was like, "Oh, it absolutely is."
It's
You know, I
Yeah.
mean,
very political.
yeah, it talked
Yeah.
about a lot of
Yeah.
it's ecological as well. Like
Mhm.
there's a very distinct focus on ecological disaster in
Yeah.
the book, and it's kind of mentioned throughout. And I think that kind of plays into the predatory nature of like the deity type people, I guess we'll call them,
Yeah.
since it's non spoiler, but like how they're preying on us, and then we prey. It's almost like a food chain in some
Mhm.
ways.
So
Mhm.
just to answer this a little bit, the reason I keep referring to this book as weird is because I read nothing about it before I started. I knew literally zero about this book other than the book was called The Bone Clocks and by David Mitchell. So I was very confused when it was told to me that it was a fantasy for the first several bits of this book. I was like, what is happening?
Oh yeah, and
Yeah.
the thing that I like about this book quite a bit is that he gets you like really comfortable in a POV, and like I
Yeah.
mean, I don't know about you all, but like when I read Hugo's section, I was just in and hating him, but I was in his head. I was
Yes.
so in his head, and then something magical happened, and he does not bring any attention to be like, you better pay attention right now.
No,
He will
it's kind
literally
of
just
jarring.
yeah, he'll just drop something. And it's up to you to like kind of piece it together as you go, and to pick up the fact that this is like it's like a signpost, right? It's like, hey, this is
Yeah.
really important. This is magical. This is insane. Remember this moment. And
Yes.
I like that. I like the bit of trust in it. Actually,
Mm.
I'm reading a fantasy book right now, and the author just keeps reminding me of stuff. And I'm like, I would love if we stopped this, because this book's 650 pages and it could be 500 if you quit
What book
repeating
is it,
yourself.
Jimmy?
Waking Fire by Anthony Ryan, but that is not an indictment of that book. I'm actually enjoying it. I'm about 100 pages in, but
Okay.
100 pages in, we're already repeating stuff constantly to
Ah,
Yeah.
remind me. And I'm like, I promise I'm not dumb. Like, I
Yeah.
promise. Well, I'm pretty
so
dumb, but I can remember little things.
yeah,
I
no,
felt
I
that way.
love
Go
sorry.
ahead, Joanna.
Oh, I was just gonna say I love that too. I think I'm gonna probably wait till the spoiler section, but there were a couple of things he did that I picked up on from early in
Yeah.
the book that came together later in the book that I thought were just absolutely brilliant and that made me
Mhm.
so excited. I think I really enjoy that in a book these days. And you're right, Jimmy. It seems like a lot of fantasy authors tend to
Well, it reads very literary. Like feel like you're reading like contemporary fiction, and
Yes.
then all of a sudden you got people that are feasting off of like life, and you're like, wait, what? Like,
Yeah.
so I agree with you that it's weird in that aspect. I
Yeah.
think like just the framing of the fantastical stuff is weird. Are there weirder books out there like a Clive Barker?
Oh,
Yes,
100%.
clearly. But I know
100%.
what you mean whenever
Yeah.
you say weird, because
Yeah.
and that's the thing about urban fantasy is like, I don't know. I read like His Dark Materials and I felt like completely okay with it. Whereas this
Yeah.
one, I felt like more like kind of off step about. I was like, oh yeah,
Yes.
that's right. This is a fantasy world. I forgot.
And I think that's the way to put it, is very off stuff. Like I kept messaging Joanna and I was like, okay, but what is this? Like what genre of book is this? Because I
Magical
was so
realism.
confused. And then that's the thing. It was like, okay, it's this blending of magical realism and urban fantasy. And then at times it felt very sci-fi-ish to me
Mhm.
personally. And I was just like, okay, this is like a melange of genres that are being kind of shoved together, which is interesting. And then once I kind of disengaged that part of my brain where I had to classify where this book fell into, I found I was able to immerse myself in the story a lot more because I
Mhm.
was kind of hooked into this idea. I was like, oh, well, it's fantasy. So it should be following these rules almost. And then when it wasn't, I found that very jarring. So going into this book, I would recommend to people have zero expectations of what you would typically expect out of a fantasy novel and just go into it willing to go along with what he does in the story. And then I think it's less weird.
I can
If
see
that
what you're
makes sense.
saying. I can see what you're saying about that. I mean, I actually probably wouldn't expect to see this in the fantasy section at Barnes& and Noble, for
It's
example,
Yeah.
not.
but
It's not.
it's probably the literary fiction section.
Yeah.
And I think it's really funny. And this is probably not a spoiler to say it, but there's a quote in the book that made me laugh out loud where there's an author and he's telling his, I don't know if it's his publisher or someone who he's talking to or his editor, saying, and they would say something like, it's half fantasy or maybe one third fantasy. And he's like, that's like saying a woman's half pregnant. And I felt like it was kind of like I felt like it was kind of like a meta joke of the book.
Oh, he definitely pokes fun at himself
Yeah.
in the book multiple times, which
Yeah.
I just got this sense, and we should say I've already said it's humorous, but like this book also has a wide range of emotions, which is why I
Mm.
think it's like a great piece of like literature. I think
Yeah.
that it really encompasses a lot of the human experience, but there is a good naturedness to David Mitchell's writing and even the characters that are so dastardly. And I'm not someone who is ever gravitating towards feel good. Almost never. You know, I like my dark and depressing stories. David Mitchell just made me feel good, even whenever he was tackling things like mortality and even like a childhood trauma, a traumatic event. For the book, I always felt like I don't know. I came out of it a little bit uplifted and maybe optimistic, but not. I don't know. Sometimes when it happens, I get annoyed. Like it's too cheesy or something. I
It
never really
wasn't
felt
cheesy.
that. I feel like he was still looking at the hard truths of life and the brutality that we impose on each other and everything else. But there's just something about his writing that makes me happy. I don't know. I don't really know how to explain it.
I think it's bittersweet, but maybe a little more emphasis on the sweet than
Sweet.
we're used to.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah.
Okay. I feel like we need to start talking about some key stuff and some spoiler talk here. So I'm
Yeah.
going to put up our little spoiler banner here. If you don't want to be spoiled, please leave. We love having you here, but I
Get
don't
out of
want
here.
your reading experience to be ruined. So I will give everyone like 10 more seconds of just blabbering on here until you decide what it is you're going to do.
Yeah.
So we're done. Okay. So I felt very strongly about the POVs in general. One of the things that I really appreciated the fact that Mitchell did, and I mentioned this to Jimmy after I finished the book, was that it's so obvious that he does his research so thoroughly.
Yeah.
And the reason I can say this is because one of the characters is from Montreal, and I myself am from Montreal, which I really enjoyed. And he was talking about like not popular places, which I actively loved. I was like, Outremont is like a very small subsection of Montreal that people don't typically know. And I was like, David Mitchell did his research here. Like, this is
Yeah.
great. The language for each POV was so specific. Like, Holly in the beginning, you were like, okay, well, she's clearly British. She's
Mhm.
from this general region, this time period. And it was so, so well done that when you did get that POV switch initially for each POV, I was like, whoa, it almost felt like whiplash because it was so vastly different from all of the other voices. And I ended up really loving that.
I agree.
And it was great.
And we're jumping time, so it makes sense to part of
Yeah.
that jump or part of that disorientation as well.
Yeah, if you think about like all the time periods covered, the variety of POVs and the different places, everything, it's really kind of crazy, and
Yeah.
it's epic in that sense. Like it's epic
Yeah.
scope, and he just feels really prepared for whatever he's writing. And there is something kind of nice about that as someone who like doesn't know a lot about stuff to hear like like Lori, for you to say that, it makes me trust the fact that like he's reading and doing his research. I mean, Guy Gavrier is another person who does a
Very
ton of
much so.
research, right?
Yeah.
And I've always appreciate that. I wish I could point at it more and be like, I know that they did their research because of this, but that doesn't surprise me because like I know Ursula K. Le Guin was a huge fan of his, and then he was obviously a big fan of hers, and she also did a ton of research for her stuff. So I love the POVs. I was reading a criticism of the book, and they were actually very positive. It was almost like overwhelmingly positive. And they said, if I had to pick out one thing, is that I felt like the language of each POV was too similar. And I couldn't have disagreed more. I
Not at
actually
all.
now, and I will say this, in literary fiction, since we're in a first person and not a third person omniscient narrator, I think what they were saying was the exposition wasn't stylized as much. Like literally, like for instance, like if Faulkner wrote one of the POVs, they'd be talking in the Southern dialect with a bunch of abbreviation. So I think maybe, and in literary fiction, it's a lot more prevalent. So I think maybe that's what they were saying. But I personally felt like I was transported into another person's head every time. And his character voices were so strong. I mean, Hugo Lamb is literally probably one of my favorite character voices. I hate the guy, but
Oh,
like,
he's
how
vile.
good?
I loved that character, though I loved
Oh,
how much I hated him
I
and
hated
how
him.
much I struggled when he started liking Holly
oh yeah.
because it
I
warmed me up
felt
to
it.
him, and I was like,
I
"How
felt
dare
it.
you?"
I
I
messaged
know.
Joanna when I was in the Hugo chapter, and I was like, "Nope, play. I do not like this man at all." But then when uh Constantine shows up for Hugo, I was like, "Ooh!" And I like got really excited. And they're like, "Chapter over." I was like, "What?" You know,
Yeah.
it was one of those things where it took me the whole chapter of like really getting on board with Hugo, because in Hugo's voice for me was the most frustrating of all
Oh
of
yeah,
them, because like you want to jump in the book and punch him in the face. He's
without a
so
doubt.
He's a
infuriating.
classic narcissist. I mean,
Yes.
he's gotta be
And
DSM classic
Oh yeah.
narcissist.
he was a bastard subtly too. Like,
Yeah.
and that's what I was saying about like not the big signposting. Like, I believe someone could surface read Hugo's chapter and be like, he's okay. But it's like the little things he says on the phone, and you realize that he ripped off his best friend, or like
Oh yeah.
inviting his friend's girlfriend. It's like, dude,
He set that
and
up.
the thing, the way it's
Oh,
said, it's in his POV, so he says it as if it's okay. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah. No.
and that's what
yeah.
I'm getting mad because I'm
Yeah.
arguing. I'm like, bro, you're a piece of shit. Like,
He
you're off.
is the worst.
No,
Like
he's
the
really
worst.
bad. He's really bad. I mean, he set it up so that to sell his friend's car he set it up for his friend to lose all his money
Yep.
gambling. And he had
And
Abandons
no conscience about it. Like no
abandons his
conscience.
other friends to the pimps. Like Hugo is
to
just
the pimp thing.
you know, it's like this whole thing. There was that scene, but the scene that really, I was driving and listening to the audiobook, and I actually audibly was like, no, when he was having that relationship and they were like in the closet because God forbid someone could see him with this woman. And I was like, he is the biggest piece of shit. I just hate him, and was having this visceral reaction while driving. And I was like, okay, I feel like I'm starting to speed because I'm getting so angry. Like it was just so bothersome. But by the end of that, when he really starts to then encounter Holly, I was like,
Mhm.
oh, this is a really interesting dynamic, because it's that classic, like you said, Joanna, that narcissist where it's like someone isn't interested in them. So it's a conquest, right? And it was really interesting to see this sort of slight evolution with Hugo, where it's like, oh, I actually have a deeper feeling and connection with Holly. And I
Yeah.
was like, I'm not falling for it, Hugo. I'm not falling for it. You still suck. But I was really interested in how that was going to work out, which was it was a roller coaster of emotions, the Hugo
Well,
chapter.
the thing that got me though was how he set up for his friend to lose all his money gambling so that he could sell the car and make money. And then when he finds out that his friend drives off a cliff, his first thought is not, "Oh my gosh, he's dead. What did I do?" No, his first thought was so much money.
I can't sell the car now.
Yeah. He was upset
Yeah.
about losing the money.
And
Like
if you think
it
there aren't
was
people out there
sick.
like that, there are. I
I
Yeah.
assure you,
know.
there are people
Oh,
out
there
there.
Yeah.
are.
And I want to
Yeah.
100%.
point out something about Hugo. Hateable. Just up. I want to punch him in the face. Never sexually abused a woman.
That's true.
No.
Didn't kick a puppy. Didn't kill an innocent child. You know what I'm saying? This is like whenever I talk about like antagonists, I'm like, I'm just tired of seeing all these sociopathic antagonists that are
Yeah.
just like murdering people and
Mhm.
abusing them. And
No.
Hugo is how you write I mean, he's actually, one of the characters we're in head with, but he's an antagonist, right? For the most part. And
Yeah.
it's like, That is what I've been looking for. And when I read that, it was after the streak of everyone having some sociopathic or religious zealot. And I was just
Sure.
like so exhausted. And then I read Bone Clocks and I was like, that is a memorable, like that's a great character. And
Yeah.
think about this. Mitchell does something incredible with Hugo at the end when they're snowed in and you get this cozy feeling. And I could feel it. I mean, and
Mhm.
I don't know if you guys have ever been snowed in with somebody. Alan
I
tells a story.
have.
Well, yeah, I would say you were in Canada, so you were probably snowed in like every other day, right?
For
But there
years,
is
snowed in.
there's something about being in a place in a time like that that is very maybe not even romantic, but like intimate. And I know Alan tells a story about he was in a house with Christina during a hurricane, and that was like whenever he was like, "Oh wow, like this girl's amazing," right? And I felt that and I started to feel for Hugo. And then that is also kind of David Mitchell's charm when we talk about that,
Yeah.
this maybe sweetness more than bitter, is that he's really talking about love because he says
Yes.
Hugo, we find out at the end, Hugo legitimately, as much as he could,
Yes.
loved Holly. And because of that love, we were able to see him through just a slightly different light. And for a sliver of a second, this dastardly dude, we could feel for him. And I've always thought that the fiction that is able to do something like that and stretch the empathy is like that's the best stuff in the world to me. And that's why I love this book so much. I mean, a lot of the reasons why I love this book is actually because of Holly and Hugo. And Holly, sorry, I'm ranting, but like Holly, what a strong female protagonist that isn't wielding a big sword. And I know we're in a magical realism world, but not girl bossing it. She's just being a lady and making good decisions and confident. And
And
Love
sometimes
it.
not
I love
making good
it.
decisions, sometimes making very poor decisions, but
yes.
owning those decisions. Like
Can I
that's
say
the
really
thing.
quickly though
That's right.
about Hugo? Another thing I want to say too about like how he didn't, like you were saying, Jimmy, his personality wasn't kicking puppies and that kind of thing. I also thought there was something. I'm not saying that this made his character anything that I would appreciate in a sense, but I don't know how to say this the right way without making it sound like I think it's redeemable by any means. But I thought there was something to the fact that he was doing all this scheming, getting all this money for the fact that he saw his friends being privileged and riding off the coattails of being privileged and
Mm-hmm.
knowing that there was a dead end to that and knowing that he had to do something now to prevent that from happening in the future. I couldn't
Mhm.
help but see some. I don't, like I said, it doesn't make him redeemable in any way by doing that. But there was something about that that I kind of appreciated in his character and still hated
Mhm.
him for doing it because he
Yeah.
was able to see past his privilege. He was able to see like there's there's a deadline to all of this that I get from being at Cambridge and going and partying in the Alps and having all these hot girls, even though it was just deplorable and disgusting. But yes,
Yeah.
but I also just want to echo too the scene with Holly being snowed in, making her the pizza, and the fact that he kept evading questions about himself, which is so anti-narcissistic when he's such a
Yeah.
narcissist. And he keeps on letting her tell him about herself. And she
Mhm.
shares so much. She opens up so much. And
Oh,
for him to be there and to listen and to, ah, it was
and,
so
and he,
good.
he tells her, your brother's death is not your fault.
Yes.
Yes. Yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes. And that was the other thing too I noted. I'm like, this is a narcissist telling somebody to have empathy, to see from what if you were in your brother's point of view, you wouldn't want you to be suffering. You would
Mhm.
And I was like,
I
"You're
mean,
a narcissist and you're telling her that. That's brilliant. Mitchell,
he
you
is
are
a
brilliant."
narcissist, but what's interesting about him, right, is that he's a dichotomy because he has privilege but isn't privileged. Like he comes from a lower class family
Yep.
and has been the underdog of all of his Cambridge friends who come from money. So he has that class perspective going into it, right? Where it's like, I'm not going to be given these things the way that they are. I'm going to have to scheme or plan or do
That's what I'm
something.
saying. Yeah,
Yeah, and
he doesn't
that's what I'm saying. It's
yeah.
so interesting because it's not common that, like Jimmy was saying, right? That we get a villain or antagonist like that. It's like, oh, it's usually some like evil lord or baron or someone that
Mhm.
comes from a pure position of privilege or is just a terrible human being, whereas Hugo is very layered and nuanced. And even though most of those layers are douche, it's like this
Yeah.
small core. You have this weird sense of empathy for him because you're like, you can turn it around. It's like you just want him to turn it around. And that scene with Holly being snowed in, you're like, the glimmer of hope is there, and you're
Mm.
just wanting to see it through. And then the end of the chapter happens, and you're like, oh, guys, he's not going to take it. But then simultaneously, you sit back and you think, was that the better choice for Holly? And that's what then I started thinking was really interesting. Like, how much of his decision was
Mm.
a selfish choice?
Yeah.
Or was it like how much of the decision was a selfish decision? It just made it so much more complicated in terms of my hating him and terms of my less hating him.
Well, I think that that was also consistent with his character when he chose to go with the, anchorites not anchorites, right? Anchorites, yes.
Anchorites,
Is
yeah.
that the right word?
I can't remember the names.
It's the
Yeah,
anchorites, and then the
uh,
horologists are our good ones.
okay, yeah, and the reason I think it was consistent with his decision is that, like we were saying, with his, ability to be very forward-thinking and strategic, even though he did so in very deplorable ways,
Yeah.
he also was forward thinking with the situation with Holly as much as he was building a real connection, and I don't think that went away. I think we saw
No.
that that was still there,
Mhm.
decades
Mhm.
later. He still felt for Holly, which, it just tugged at me.
Yeah.
But anyhow, it was consistent with his character that in that moment when he's offered that decision and has to take that leap of faith, he thinks through what's gonna happen if I stay with her. And
Mhm.
he thinks through the reality of that situation, and that's why
Yep.
he doesn't stay with her. He doesn't
Yeah,
see it
because
as
he's gonna
last.
get charged. I mean,
Yeah.
he had the stamp collection.
Oh,
I mean, he's
yeah.
he's been caught.
Mhm.
I mean,
Yeah,
he's basically
yeah.
he's been caught. By the way, the
Mm.
stamp collection thing, I absolutely loved it.
Yeah.
Uh, I don't know why, but I thought it was funny.
It was.
And the thing about this is that when you paint him as the underdog, it I like the idea of him kind of like putting his privileged friends in terrible situations where they have to pay for that. Like that's something I can kind of get behind.
Yeah.
But this is also possibly kind of Mitchell poking fun at the system, right?
Mhm.
Like
Yeah.
and
100%.
right in Holly's first part, we get this thing where she goes and visits that farm and there's like these pro-communist people who end up getting killed. And then we
Yeah.
find out that Esther was hiding in, I think, one of them, or and then that I can't remember all the details, but
Yeah.
this is what I'm saying. Like, yeah, this is kind of a political book because now in the
Oh,
second, he's clearly
totally.
tackling class, like the issue of class within,
Mhm.
um, in England. So, and oh man, the posh, like it was just like oh god, I loved it. I
Mhm.
Yeah.
When
tremendous.
I don't really think there is a POV that doesn't in some way deal with politics because
Mhm.
Ed's is super on the nose. Like there's no way around it,
Yeah,
right?
and
Like
really, I found it kind of hard to read, not because it was bad, but because that's reality. I mean, there were
I
people who were
yeah.
literally putting themselves back into the war zones because they could not. And, we obviously can talk about PTSD and all these other things, but like even back then, that wasn't something that people were considering heavily.
no.
And for me, whew, Ed's POV tore me apart because he could not be there for his family anymore.
Yeah.
And I was trying to assign how much of that is on him and how much of that is just like human mentality. I don't know, but whew,
I I love so initially when I read it, Ed's was my favorite. Crispin ended up becoming my favorite by the end of the book.
Crispin's hilarious.
Yeah,
But
Kristen is hilarious.
Ed's for me, I do have PTSD. So reading Ed's chapter for me was really interesting because
Hmm.
I don't feel like it's very often that authors capture PTSD well because it's kind of just like, oh, this traumatic thing happened to me and now I'm really brave. So now I go do things. And it's like, no, that's not quite how PTSD works. And when you're seeing his struggle of trying to return to some semblance of normalcy, just having a conversation with his daughter, trying to figure out like where Holly is in her cycle, like just basic things that are relationships with your immediate family. I was like, oh, this is hard. Like this is really really hard. And then the way that they did the flashbacks for him,
Yes.
it's like was one of the best things I've ever read. It was just done so well because
Mm.
when you're dealing with trauma, like I'm speaking for myself, whenever I'm in that state of panic, it's like I could be here having this conversation with you right now, but in my brain, I could be reliving that traumatic event. Even though I'm
Yeah.
talking to you, like I'm semi here, but I'm not really here. And that's how Ed's POV came across to me, is like he had one foot in each camp at all times. And I was like, that is so exhausting and so relatable. Loved it.
I have to say something about that. So
Mm-hmm.
one thing that I found so powerful about Ed's story, and by the way, Ed's story was my favorite. I
Mm.
got so emotional. I will not lie. When I read Crispen Hershey's section, which also made me laugh a lot. But when I read his section and when I read about Ed's death, I had to put the book down. I started
That killed
crying.
me.
Same. I was
Yeah,
so upset.
I started
So upset.
crying. I cried at that moment because I loved Ed. And the thing that stuck out to me is I loved Ed even in Holly's chapter in the very beginning of the book.
Yeah.
I just instantly loved Ed. But one of the things that stuck out to me in the early conversation between Ed and Holly is that they were talking about heaven and they were talking about metaphysical things. And I know Holly was saying, what if heaven's just a series of moments? And I want to talk about that too, because I think that ties in beautifully and poetically to Holly's story. But
Mhm.
Ed, he says, I wish I could be everywhere at once. Sometimes I wish I could be everywhere at once. That would be the most amazing thing to me. And that stuck out to me. I held on to that thought. And then in his chapter, what was one of his biggest conflicts was that he wanted to be here with his family, but he also wanted to be there in the war, and he couldn't be everywhere at once. And at certain points, he didn't really want to be home. There was a
Mhm.
point where it's actually when his daughter starts screaming because he won't take her to go see the psychic
Yeah,
magician
the
guy.
psychic.
And he actually says, I wrote this down. He says, get me out of here. Anywhere's fine. And I
Mhm.
couldn't help but like, feel that because I'm like, young Ed, idealistic Ed wanted to be everywhere. And
Mhm.
older Ed, he can't live in that idealism anymore. And he
Mhm.
realizes he has to make a choice. And what was so painful is that what he was doing, being a war reporter, a journalist out in Iraq, like that is such a noble thing. I remember around that time when I was following war reporters in Iraq and like I was thinking those guys are like the heroes, man. Like they're telling a story that's not easy to tell
Mhm.
and trying to be neutral, but trying to like tell it as it is. And yeah, it was so sad to see that, like, it was so underappreciated. Holly didn't get it, Holly's family didn't get it, and I got why they didn't get it. Like, if I were Holly's brother or sister, I would also be like, "Ed, what are you doing? You're not with your family."
Mhm.
But at the same time, like, he's doing this thing that's so important. It's so important, and it does stretch politically. But
Oh
Mhm.
yeah.
gosh,
It
I the fact that he was responsible for Nazir and Aziz's death, uh that
yeah,
was
it's
painful, and
just
I love, by
so
the way, that
layered.
the flashbacks, as you were saying really quickly, I love that the flashbacks were told in first person past tense, whereas the
Yeah.
rest of the story is told in first person present tense. I just
Mhm.
thought
Yes.
that was really clever.
I agree completely because you just it would always take me a second with Ed, and I'm like, where are we? Like mentally, where are we? You know?
Mhm.
And for he's the one that inspires Holly to travel in the first section of the book. Like he says he wants to go to Istanbul and he's a kid of wanderlust and he shares
Mhm.
that passion with Holly, which obviously we know from the second portion she endeavors upon because she's in Switzerland where she meets, D-bag Hugo. And it was it's just so interesting because for the people that I have known in my life, like I used to travel quite a bit because Josh lived in the States and I lived in Canada. So we dated internationally. So it was a lot of back and forth. And
Mhm.
when I moved to the US, I had a really hard time sitting still. I was so used to moving all the time. And I have friends that work half the year and travel half the year and like they can't sit still. And when I was reading this, I was like, this is Ed's core, right? Like he wanted to just explore and learn and travel, and that manifested into a career that is incredibly difficult and full of pain and trauma. And then when you get the story of their deaths, you're like, oh.
Yeah.
And it's crushing the soul of someone that just wanted to experience the good of the world, and their job is reporting the bad of the world. And that job takes you away from that sliver of what is supposed to quintessentially be the good part of your life. You know, your partner, your child, and family. And you just can't, how do you cope with it?
Bad
And
dad. I thought the
yeah,
bad dad.
bad dad, you know, and it was so heartbreaking, but simultaneously like so well written, just so well written. Ed's whole
Yeah.
thing was perfection. I loved
Oh,
it.
I couldn't stop reading Ed's section, and I really did. It got to me so much when he
And the
That's the
died.
one.
contrast,
Go ahead, Jimmy.
I was say the contrast between seeing him with Holly and then all of a sudden you got him as a POV and you're like, oh, Ed.
Yeah.
Oh, and then you're like, oh,
Oh,
Ed.
Ed.
Yeah.
And I'm going to
Yeah.
tell you, that is the stuff. Like, that's what's human about this book is like
Mhm.
that's
Yeah.
real. And then having a balance of, well, should I have a kid? I'm supposed to get married. I'm supposed to do these things, but I also know that this thing inside me is telling me to go do this. And then, you know, you could argue that he died doing what he wanted to do, but think about the impact that had on his family and his children. And that's the thing that I just love about the vignettes is like just these little interactions, butterfly affecting. Like
Yeah.
Ed 100% had an impact on Holly Sykes, and Holly had probably had an impact on him. And then from there on, you know, we go down the line. And but I
Mhm.
just I don't know, the contrast between Ed in the first chapter and being like Ed, and then it's just like people
Yeah.
get to that point, and you don't, you know, it's tough. It's really
It's
really tough.
heartbreaking. It was just so heartbreaking. And like
Mhm.
I've told everybody this since becoming a parent. Like I read differently and I experience the news differently and stuff. Like it used to be that I would read about a child disappearance and be like, oh, that's, you know, a horrible thing. But as soon as you become a parent, you're like, that could be my child. And what, like that reading experience of when their daughter just vanished,
Oh
I was
my
like,
god.
oh my God. I like went into absolute panic while reading it. Cause like Joanna, I could not put down that section and was like hyperventilating while reading. I was like, where is this kid? And it's just because you hear about those stories, right? Where it's like a kid goes missing on one parent's watch,
Yep.
and then what that does to the relationship. And I'm sitting there thinking like, what's happened to the daughter? What's gonna happen between Holly and Ed? Like what is the outcome of this? And then it made so much sense at the end of it. You're like, oh, he leaves because it's like they can't really recover from something like that, almost is kind of how it came across to me in
The
the
issue
end.
already sat there, and then that almost happened, right?
Yeah.
And it was enough to kind of be like, well, we got to open this up and talk about it now. And then they
Yeah.
have that very tough conversation. I wonder if that portion of the book is not kind of maybe inspired by a real case where a couple went on vacation and then they put the like it was a bunch of families together. They always vacation. I think they might have been doctors in England, and they all went to this resort. I can't remember where it was, maybe Peru or something, and they put the kids to bed and then walked literally like 100 yards down to the hotel bar, and a girl went missing. I think it's called Madeline's Missing, I think is the Netflix documentary on it. Sad, great documentary, but very sad. And people are saying the parents might have something to do. Like there's this, no one knows. And as soon as the kid went missing, I thought of that case and I was like, I wonder if Mitchell's pulling from this because it was a very famous case. And
Yeah.
I just wonder, I would love that if I ever got to interview him, I'd ask him if he's ever heard of that case because it was almost set up similarly.
Very similar. Yeah.
Yeah.
I had heard of that story. I didn't put two and two together, but I could definitely
It's like
see
the
that
worst nightmare
for
for
sure.
a parent. I mean, outside of
Yeah.
obviously even worse things, but like,
Yeah.
ugh.
Yeah.
That whole thing was panic inducing to me though,
Oh
because
my God.
I like
So
Ed
much.
still. And I was like,
That's
no.
And I mean, you're reading it thinking like, well, she's obviously gone to the psychic, right? And then he gets to the psychic and she's not there. I'm like, where is this kid? Like, I was so nervous while reading it. It was just, yeah, it was so much. But whew.
So, Slightly on a different note, Noah Guy brought up in the chat about Ed's conversation with, and that's with the Holly's
Oh yeah.
great aunt at the wedding.
Mhm.
That was so fascinating because we find out that Holly's aunt is in on the script.
Yeah.
Whatever
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
script is, and that we find out more about Jacko in that
Mhm.
particular scene too.
Mhm.
That Jacko wasn't really Jacko and Jacko
Yeah.
disappeared. So I
Which is
thought I love
wild.
that.
Like,
Yeah.
that's again, one of those conversations that could just slide by you while you're reading, but it has a lot of stuff that's important, in
Mhm.
it. I mean, even in the beginning, right? Whenever Holly gets told about the maze, and then it ends up tying into the end, and
So
I
Joanna
love
and
that.
I were messaging a little bit in the beginnings, and then we're like, okay, we'll save the rest of it for the chat. But that was one of the few things we are like, that maze is definitely going to be
Oh, yeah.
important.
oh,
I
Like,
said
yeah.
that. I called it. I was like, "That
If
man is
honestly, that
definitely
might be the
coming
most
in."
obvious thing in the book.
yeah.
Like, if
Yeah.
anything that there's very few things about this book that I would say, like, I wasn't huge on this. Maybe the huge red flag above the maze was a little too on the nose for how subtle everything else was in the book.
Mm, interesting.
Yeah.
So Ed's chapter, heart wrenching for everybody. And then you get a fun jump to Crispen
Oh,
Hershey, who is like another despicable but lovable human.
Oh, I
he
really want y I really will quickly say since we're this far in the book, though, that there was one other thing, and this isn't really a criticism, but I got irritated with it, and that's
Mhm.
that I feel like Mitchell, at least 3 times in this book, in these different POVs, kept on bringing up this idea that, women have sex in order to get love and that men need sex to feel loved, and I felt like it just
Um,
kept coming up. And I'm like,
mm,
"Stop.
yeah,
Stop."
I think I
It's not
remember
really a
that
criticism.
too.
I mean, like, I get it because, I mean, that's authentic to the characters he's portraying,
yeah.
but I didn't like it. I don't know, personally.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing is with this book, I felt that none of the relationships were overly healthy relationships, right? So, I
Mhm.
mean, in the sense that, like, I think in their youth, the relationship between Ed and Holly is very loving and pure, but then it's clear that it's gone off the rails by the time that we get to the Ed POV. Hugo and Holly is pretty toxic from the start. Crispin has a slew of really toxic relationships,
Oh,
which
wow.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm
Crispin might
going
be the worst.
Crispin,
uh,
yes.
Crispin was just so when the Ed POV ended, I was crestfallen because like I knew I was like, it's gotta be coming. And then of course you start with Crispin, and I was like, who is this guy who's just like
Talking in third
talking in
person.
third person? Yeah, I was like, he's so weird and annoying. And then I fell in love with him so quickly. I was like, he's diabolical and delightful all in one neat package.
Yeah, he's so bitter and hates being controlled by his publisher, and,
Yeah.
like, I love the fact that was it Cheese? Was that the
Cheeseman.
critic?
Yeah.
Cheeseman, and
Yeah.
then he's from the Hugo, and you remember how he was
Yep.
talking good about
Yeah.
I mean, just, like, little things like that. I know that, like, I don't know. I thought all that was so cool because
I
how
love it.
quickly people turn, and I'm like, I would be bitter too.
Yeah.
I would be mad.
I think Crispin is that quintessential tortured artist where
Mhm.
it's I was talking to someone about this not long ago where it's so frustrating where it's like people don't know an author's masterpiece, but they know that like terrible first book that they wrote and that's what they became the most famous for. And that felt like Crispin where he's like, I've done all of these wonderful things and all you people want to talk about is this one stupid book. And then he keeps comparing it to Holly, which was then so interesting because like if we go back to the Ed chapter for a brief second and we have that run in with Immaculate Constantine or whatever, and she gives us a little bit of perspective in that where it's like, oh, Holly was special because she had this third eye type thing, and the
Mhm.
daughter doesn't have it, and Ed is useless according to her, so she just moves on really quickly. And that experience profoundly changed Holly, which makes perfect sense. So that
Mhm.
she then kind of has this career shift, and that's how her intersection with Crispin comes about. I thought this was really great because for you see all the time, right? When like a parent or some person has this life altering moment or event that it can be a total life shift for them. And that seemed to be the case for Holly. And I really liked how much of Holly we got in the Crispen
Yes.
chapters. Like, it felt the most natural, I almost feel like,
Mhm.
between all of the pairings. I was like, "Oh, I really like the dynamic between her and Crispen." I liked it a lot.
They
Yeah,
were so
and the
different too, which is
Yeah.
kind of interesting.
yeah,
Yeah.
and Holly befriends him, and they
Yeah.
become close friends, and, I mean, I would say that Crispin's probably somewhat interested in Holly, right? But
Oh,
I
yeah.
like whenever characters can be friends. I'm a big
Yep.
fan of that, and I was worried. I was actually worried Crispin was gonna end up
Yeah.
with Holly and they were gonna get married or something, and
Yeah.
I was so glad that it kinda stayed away from that.
Mhm.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yes. I got
Yeah.
oh gosh. Yeah, I really like, I think that part of what made him and Holly work oddly was, was Holly's daughter, and I do not understand how to pronounce Holly's daughter's name, even though I heard the audiobook narrator for this because I immersion read it. It was like Aifa, but
Ava?
it's the weirdest spelling. It's
Yeah,
like
Ava.
Aoife. Is that a common name anywhere in the world? I don't
I
know.
think it's Irish. I think it's the
Oh,
Irish for
really?
Ava. Yeah, because
Okay.
she's her mother was Irish, right? So I think
Yes, it
she went
was.
with the
Yeah.
Celtic spelling for, Ava.
Yeah. Oh, okay, cool. Thanks for
Yeah.
clarifying that. Yeah, but I thought that their interactions were, like, endearing. I think that that was
Very.
what endeared, Crispin Hershey to me because he's so ridiculous. Like,
Oh my
he's
gosh.
so egotistical, he's so in his
Oh,
head, he is so
another
funny,
narcissist.
and
He
I
literally
did
got someone
wonder.
locked up for
He
critiquing his book.
sure did.
Well, and I also felt like there were some meta things with his chapters too, because like, I mean, yes, of course, because it's an author talking about his books, but the way that Cheeseman, I should probably pull it up, but there's a specific uh yeah, there was a specific like line that Cheeseman wrote about him being um, writing in a tortured way and avoiding cliches, and I'm like, "That is what it's like being in Crispin's head." Like,
Yeah,
it felt
exactly.
tortured, and it felt like everything that Cheeseman wrote in that review. I'm like, "This is what it's like in this guy's head. Like, this is
Oh my
exactly
gosh.
what his voice is like."
Mhm.
And,
So
and at the
yeah.
same time, he's hilarious. Like, there was that one scene where he's meeting Aoife, and Eva's like, "Look at this animal. It's an" I can't remember what kind of animal it is. He's like, "What is that aside from a good Scrabble score word?" And,
Or
like,
yeah.
but my favorite line in the line that made me laugh the hardest in this whole book was when he has a I guess, like man, I'm reading this a little out of context, I'm sorry, but he senses the muzzle of the handgun an inch from my forehead. "Run, beg, fight, but like a suffering dog who knows what the vet's needle is for, I remain inert. Bowel and bladder stay control, stay operative. Small mercies, final seconds, final thoughts. Anise, as a little girl, proudly presenting her handmade book, the rabbit family goes on a picnic. Juno telling me how the coolest boy in her year told her that to understand him, she had to read a book called Desiccated Embryos. I just died. I laughed so hard at that line.
Uh-huh. Desiccated embryos, by the way, was my personal favorite thing about Crispen Hershey because I did IVF and the amount I had to talk about embryos, but hearing it referred to as desiccated embryos, I loved so much. But my favorite thing for him was so niche because his ex-wife is French Canadian and the way he describes her family is so accurate. I was sitting there going, it's like he's lived there and knows because the French Canadians have such a distinct personality as a group. And I was like, how? How does he know this for like a minor sub character person? Like it was just so specific. And all of his recountings of his ex-wife and her new partner and their money and his children, I was like, this to me is perfection because it was just so teeming with bitterness that I loved it so much.
Oh, he had
And yeah,
bitterness. Yeah, for sure.
it was
I was
so
kind of
good.
confused at one point when I was reading his chapter because and it took me a while to figure it out. Like I felt kind of dumb because there was this whole entire part in the chapter where he's talking about his wife and his daughters dying in a car accident. Do you remember
Yes.
that? And then I was
I
like,
was very confused by that at first. I was like, what just happened?
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
and it took me a while, and so what I concluded finally is that that was a fantasy, because that was the moment that he met Carmen.
yeah.
So he saw Carmen and he's like, "Wow, she's hot." And then maybe he went into a fantasy of like, "And then my wife and daughters, they died in a car accident," like freeing him
Yeah.
up. I mean, I don't know if
I
that's
mean, that
exactly
is a
what
plot of
was.
a novel, right? Like that, I think that's what he was doing, was
I
like
think
he was
so too.
Oh.
thinking
I
in
thought it was a
in
plot for
plot.
one of his stories. That's kind of what I got. He would kind of go in and out of these
Like, oh,
schemes for
this would make a good
stories.
story. Yeah, like
Yeah,
that's how good
exactly.
stories go.
Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah, it
Yeah,
was
that
just so bizarre.
Yeah.
But I
Which
was
was
so confused for a second there. I'm like, "Wait, didn't they die though?" And now he's
yeah.
talking about them again? Yeah.
Mhm.
mhm.
I
But,
loved him.
yeah,
I
he
thought he
was
was so great.
hilarious.
And then his whole
Desiccated
thing with
Embryos, what
Carmen.
a great title. I just
Mhm.
it's
Yeah, I
crazy.
loved his interactions with Carmen as well. How he had planned this whole life, and Carmen was like, "Well," and then he's like, "Great." But the thing for me of Crispin, the Shanghai scene, I
Mm.
really loved because that's where we start getting into the nuances of Holly, of her experiences with these abilities, basically, how she
Yeah.
can kind of see things, know things, and we get that little snippet of Crispin's future, basically, where she tells him those words, and he's
Mhm.
like, "Okay, crazy lady,"
Mhm.
and how that came together at the end of Crispin's story. I was like,
I
it
mean, the
was
end of
just,
Crispin Stories is insane.
yeah, it sure is.
And I think it's over the top on purpose, personally. I felt like it was a plot of a book. Like, it would
Mhm.
happen in a book, and therefore Crispin's end comes like that. Like, it was such an absurd thing.
Yeah,
But it
yeah.
does have a good callback, and then you get the one eye thing and the spider web and whatever. Um,
Mhm.
oh
Well, and
god.
there's this whole thing too called the script. And
Yeah.
that's something that Solio Moore, that author, keeps telling him. It's like
Yeah.
the script. It's you didn't follow the script.
Mhm.
Yeah. And then that kind of leads us into this fifth POV, which is where most of the information gets relayed to us, right? Like this is the big fantasy POV, is basically how I viewed it when I read it. Marinus is our main POV for this one. And pretty early on into the POV, we realize we've met Marinus earlier in the story, very, very early in the first POV
Yep.
on the docks with Holly. So this is, I had good things about this chapter and then issues with this chapter. And I think Joanna is kind of in agreement with me in the issue sense that this felt very rushed when they get
Agreed.
to the actual apex of
Yep.
what this war is between these two
Mhm.
groups. That felt very, very quick.
Yep.
In terms of the background story that we're kind of given, I found that part to be very interesting because we see that there's these two different groups. One are kind of vegetarians and another are carnivores in terms of
Mhm.
how they approach their magic, which I thought that's an interesting approach to it. Um, and just getting Marinus's backstory was so fascinating. Like I loved hearing about Marinus. I was like, oh, this
Yeah.
is so interesting.
Mhm.
And the lives that Marinus has led. And how she came to know her group of people, like how she first met them, that encounter, I really, really loved.
Mhm.
So what did you guys think of Marinus?
So I love Marinus. I love the idea of gender being tackled through Marinus and
Yes.
magical means. I love the idea of basically a carnivore and then a vegetarian type style for this.
Yeah.
We already I talked about kind of like preying on people and whatnot and all this, but this is the section of the book that I think is the weakest. And it is, I talked about the subtlety earlier and like no signposting. And then here he kind of is forced to do some exposition, which I
Yeah.
think the content is very interesting. I found this to be the least interesting part of the whole book, actually. I
Hmm.
actually really like Sheepshead, which we'll talk about, but it's just one of those things where I kind of felt like it was rushed. I felt like it was a lot, and I was almost missing the mundane. in
Mm.
some ways. So that for me, this is like, I think I ended up saying this book was like a 9.5 out of 10 or something for me. And I think this is the section that was a little bit rough, which, by the way, from what I could read, is not an uncommon criticism to the
Yeah,
book.
that was my criticism too. I really
Yeah.
loved her Russian backstory, and, like, that's a
Yeah,
really
Mhm.
good
so
point,
good.
by the way, about gender. That's
Oh
Oh
definitely
yeah.
yeah,
something to
I
emphasize
loved
for us.
that.
This
Um,
is a tour de force on how to handle like themes and sensitive issues. Like he's not beating us in the head with it makes you think. I mean,
Mhm.
And race too, not just
Oh
gender, but
yeah,
yes.
race as well.
Yeah.
But like you said, it felt like we got all the explanations all of a sudden about this whole entire system of magic and how it works and horology and anchorites and the fact that the horologists have 49 days between lives. I felt like I was getting such a huge influx of information. And then
yeah.
it's like, we're going to the temple. Holly, you're going with us. And it just felt like, whoa, all of a
Mhm.
sudden we're through the conflict, out of the conflict, like through the painting, in the portal. Like it just happened
Yeah,
so fast for me. Like that
it
was
was
my only
very quick.
thing. This was definitely the weakest part for me as well. Even though I thought some of the imagery was really cool, I thought Marinus was a cool character, and I mean, it was neat to learn stuff. But
Mhm.
yeah,
And a
it
rolling pin. She has
Yeah,
a rolling pin.
a
oh
trusty
yeah,
rolling pin, which as
because
a
she's an older
baker,
woman.
I
I
very
love
much
that.
appreciated.
Oh, I love it because we have a rolling pin and it's broken, but I keep it because I'm like, this is the perfect self-defense weapon. Like if I hit something with this, they're going
Exactly,
down.
I remember
exactly.
getting confused at one point because they were describing going through a Georgia O'Keeffe painting, and
Yeah,
they were talking about the sunset in the painting, and I was so confused. And I'm sure there's probably a dozen Georgia O'Keeffe paintings of sunsets out there, but I've been to the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum in Santa Fe,
Santa Fe.
and they're mostly just like most of Georgia O'Keeffe's paintings that I'm familiar with are gigantic flowers, like
Yep,
enormous
they're
Mm.
flowers
gardens.
that are very sexual looking. So when they kept saying that, I just had a moment like, "What? Wait, what?" But
Mhm.
anyway, the imagery was really cool, and, I yeah, it just I it was weird, it was interesting, it was fun to see Holly at that point of her life as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was just fast. It was just too
I
fast, but at the same time, it's like, at the same time, he kind of didn't set himself up well because, I mean,
Yeah,
what are you gonna
you
do?
needed that information.
I'm
Like, we're
pretty
already that many
yeah.
along in the book. Anyway,
I'm pretty
sorry.
sure it's a little bit of a meta thing, and Daniel brought this up. He said that part is a reference to the Crispen section, though. The way that they just flat out tell you what's going on, if you criticize it, you can copy and paste a criticism of Crispen's work, which I did catch because they kind of talked about this in Crispen's section with the
Mhm.
critic.
Yep,
And I laughed because I felt he was doing that exact thing in the next section. And
yeah.
I didn't know. I'm not sure. I'm like, is it a meta thing or is it not? And with how careful Mitchell is, it
Uh,
probably is.
I think it
Probably.
is. My big thing was I agree completely with what you said, Jimmy. The concept of gender fluidity, that you come back in a different gender with each subsequent life, I thought was so interesting. I was like, that must be so like screwing with your brain. It
Oh
must be
yeah.
just so weird to go from that to that to that. And I loved getting all of that nuance. But then you're dealing with not only the story of the anchorites and the horologist, but then you're dealing with bringing Hugo back into the mix. And then, like, you have Immaculate Constantine, who you're like, isn't the top person. She's the number two person.
Hmm.
And you don't really know who the top person is. It's kind of this ambiguous figure still. And it just felt like those were maybe, even though I liked the previous sections, when I got to this section, I was like, maybe we could have breadcrumbed some of this a little bit more in
Hmm.
the previous section so it wasn't as heavy handed when we did get here. Because I almost wish we would have had like two POVs of Marinus, kind of how we had two POVs of Holly,
Yeah.
where if earlier in the book we had Marinus's backstory and had that as a POV, and then in the later POV, we had the anchorite and the horology stuff, and that was self-containing.
Yeah.
Just because I was like, this is just so much
This is
information
one of
in
the
a
few
short
times
period.
where
Yeah.
I wish the book was almost 300 to 400 more. I mean, it's a big book. I kind of
Yeah,
wish it was longer. Honestly,
yeah,
I would have been fine
yeah.
with it. And Noah said in chat, the Russian backstory felt like it could have been lifted out Like it could have honestly been its own section, probably.
Exactly. That's kind of what I'm saying. I
Yeah.
completely agree in that. Just so you have like, it almost would have been really interesting when you think about it, right? Where it's this like ambiguous character that you don't really know that's kind of telling you like, sometimes I'm a woman, sometimes I'm a man. I've
Mhm.
lived for thousands of years. I've had this many lives, and this is how I discovered my group. End of POV. Move on to the next one. And you're like, wait, what? But that kind of fits in with the overall theme of what he was doing for me anyway, earlier in the book, where it was you would get this little snippet and he's holding his hand out to you and then be like, just kidding.
Mhm.
And then you would jump to your next POV. So I completely agree in that, Noah. I feel like that would have been a very good self-containing chapter. But what did you guys think of the temple scene itself? Like, did you like the imagery that happened with that scene? Obviously, we have our maze that kind of comes back into play at this point of the story. Like, what were our overall thoughts of this final showdown sequence?
Yeah, I really like the showdown sequence. I like the maze, and it it's funny, I remember by getting to this point, I kind of forgot about Jacko talking about the maze, and then I
Yeah.
went back and read the part at the beginning of the book, and I felt something in that moment. It actually kind of emotionally impacted me because all of Holly's life was kind of dictated by this disappearance. And it's just also there's this whole interesting thing that she disappeared, but Jacko also disappeared. And like if she had been there, could she have helped? There's all that stuff, right?
Yeah.
So I really liked it. I like the imagery of the temple and the maze. Like I said, I love the rolling pin. I thought it was fantastic.
Mhm.
So I liked it quite a bit.
Yeah. It's so interesting too about Jacko too, because I feel like that guilt just haunted her her entire life, and the fact that she didn't even mind after she found out that Jacko wasn't really Jacko
Yeah.
at that
Yeah.
point, and she still believed he was her brother. She said, "It doesn't matter. He was still my brother. I still love him." It didn't
Mhm.
change anything for her. That guilt has haunted her her entire life, and not only her, I think what's interesting too is that I think Ed was there for her and felt for her when she was going through all of that, and at the same time, I think I was surprised in Ed's chapter. I know I'm sorry, I'm going backwards a little bit.
Oh, it's
Ed felt
fine.
guilty about that too. Like, that
Mhm.
that was surprising to me in Ed's chapter. He
Yeah.
wondered if he hadn't helped Holly escape in the first chapter, if
Right.
maybe Jacko hadn't escaped. So it's just really interesting how everything comes full circle, and then, of course, the maze gets brought in to save Holly essentially in the end.
I love the idea that it didn't matter that Jacko's body was basically the vessel for
Mhm.
this spirit, because there's so much mental health play in this story, right? Like there it's just constant throughout the narrative, I feel like. And it's not quite the same as, a romantic partner or a spouse, but like if your partner has a stroke or, has mental health issues or and their personality changes, it's like that doesn't mean you stop loving them, and
Yeah.
that was very much Holly in that moment for me. It
Yep.
was like doesn't matter. Like that person, whatever spirit was living in that body was whom I loved and had
I
this
thought of
connection.
dementia. I immediately
Yeah.
thought of dementia just
Yeah.
because it's been something that has been in my life and happened, and it's like I thought that exact kind of allegory for it. I was like,
Yeah.
or metaphor,
Yeah.
maybe better way of saying
Yeah.
it.
Well, I have
No,
heard of I
exactly.
mean, there are people out there who believe, and I know this has gotta be there's gotta be some kind of mental health specific, guideline for this, but, like, there are people who actually believe that there's such a thing as walk-ins, like, people
Mhm.
other beings who
Yeah.
walk into a person, and suddenly the person's a new person, and, like,
Mhm.
there are people who actually believe that. So I don't know. I don't know what that phenomenon is,
Hmm.
but it was just interesting to see it in a fantasy
Mhm.
story here.
Yeah, I really loved it, and I mean, it was so interesting, right, to see mental health kind of play out through each of our POVs, because even in the Marinus chapter, we get a little bit of that context from Marinus's perspective of like, this is what it was like to be an ancient being in a body in this like weird Russian time period and like what that did to their mental health. And then
Yeah.
the relationships of the other horologists, especially when they get betrayed by that one guy. It's like, what was that guy's mental health state that caused him to kind of switch sides at the last minute? And then when Hugo comes back in, you're like, okay, let's break this down a little bit, Hugo. So you've gone and done these real terrible things for the last, few decades. Fine. But then simultaneously, you're like, and he hasn't changed in other ways because he still loves Holly. So
Yeah.
it was so interesting to me because I sat back and I thought about it and I was like, do I feel positively or negatively towards that trait about him? Because
Mm.
I feel like there's two ways to go about it, right? Like you can have your first love and it can be a really cherished and beautiful thing, even though both of you part ways and you go on to live separate lives, and you can think back of that quite fondly. Or I feel like there's the possibility where it's you never let go because you just choose not to, and then you get stuck in that moment kind of forever. And I
Yeah.
was like, Hugo, I feel, is stuck, whereas Holly has gone on and had life and experiences with her daughter, with Ed, with Crispin. She's had a whole existence, whereas Hugo's existence came down to that singular encounter, right? Where it
Yeah.
was like, that's it. So I thought that was really interesting
And that's
too.
really cool that I really like that too, because I know that Holly at one point, she's like, "Does he think that I just was gonna wait around for him?" I mean, she has some kind of sassy moment about
Oh
that,
yeah.
about encountering Hugo again. And she's
Mhm.
she's like, "Well, he's wrong. I moved on," you know? And so I know this isn't as heavy as far as mental health is related, but everything we're talking about as far as those topics are concerned also takes me back to Holly in the very beginning because, I mean, I know it seems kind of in some ways like, okay, silly teenager running away from home. What is she thinking?
Yeah.
Um, but at the same time, like I believed it from her character. I really actually enjoyed that first chapter because
I did too.
It
there was
grew on me.
something.
Yeah.
It worked for me personally because I feel kinda silly. I was telling my husband about how she walked in on Vinny and Stella, is that her name? The best
Oh,
friend
that
sleeping with
got me,
each
by the
other.
way. I didn't
It
even realize what was
did!
happening
Me
until, like,
Yeah.
the
neither!
reveal, and I was like, "Oh, no."
Oh, me too. It hit me, and it was so funny because I told it to my husband, and he was like, I knew it was gonna go there. As soon as you started telling me that she goes to her boyfriend's, I'm like, "How did you know?" I didn't see it coming, so it
I
was like
called
a
that immediately. I was like, this did not end well.
I mean, I knew it wasn't a good thing that they were, like,
no.
having a
Yes.
relationship, but I definitely didn't see the friend thing. Like, that
No,
that
I did
really got me.
not predict that. I did
Oh
not
man,
predict the
that's
friend
funny.
under the covers, but
That's the moment where
also,
the book hooked me, by the way. Like,
yeah.
until that
Oh
point,
yeah.
and then the running away, I was like, "I don't know," and then she gets that farm, and I'm like, "Okay, this is interesting," and like
Oh, I
every
love the
POV,
farm.
when it
I
yeah, I
loved
love the
all of it.
farm as well, and it's like when it ended is right whenever I was like, "I want more," and then he cut me
Mhm.
off. I'm like,
Well,
"Damn
the
it."
thing that I loved about all of that is that I felt like she got 3 almost 3 warnings in a way, like maybe Jacko in some
Mm,
ways, like saying, "Holly, be careful." He
Yeah.
tells her to be careful before she leaves and gives her the diabolical maze. But then when she leaves, I it warmed my heart in a way because it's like she of course, it's not as bad as it could be in the grand scheme of life,
Right.
but at the same time, the way she tells herself, "Remember the slap. Remember the slap." Like, she reinforces the memory of her mother slapping her to try to
Mhm.
force herself forward. It, to me, felt convincing why she believed she was in the right to do this. And then, Ed, at one point, says he tries to have a talk with her, and he tells her, "Look, you and your mother, you had a falling out. You're a different person. You're changing, but give her some slack. This is actually part of the deal. Like, this is kind of part of the script. This is part of what has to happen. You have to grow and change. She has to fight this, and both can you work this out. You can go back. You can figure this out." And
Yeah.
then she ends up at the farm, and the girl at the farm essentially tells her the same thing. She's like, "Look, I know where the future could end up for you. I know you really could end up like scrubbing toilets someday. And
mhm.
I know it's bad. I know you've had it bad, but as somebody who's been through worse, I promise you it could be worse. And it's not too
Yeah.
late to go back." And just the way they're telling her, it's not too late. It's not as bad as you think. And and of course, I don't know. I just thought it was just very powerful to me, especially because the whole time Holly really was homesick, and she was trying to
Mhm.
deny that in herself, especially, like, when she's telling Ed, she's like, "Heaven what if heaven is just a series of moments?" And the moments she thinks about are the moments with her family, when her
Yeah.
dog is doing this or Jacko's doing
Mhm.
that, or I don't know. So there was just so much heart in Holly and family, orientation in Holly, and her mental health wasn't obviously as tested or tried, I guess, in some ways as some other characters in the story, but I
Mhm.
feel like she was the glue in some ways. Like, I don't know,
Oh,
it
definitely.
just
Yeah,
all kind
without a
of
doubt.
worked in some
Yeah,
ways.
she's
Mhm.
the through line, you know?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Um,
100%. But that then brings us to the state of Holly's mental health at Sheepside. So I am in the minority, I think, where this was the weakest section for me, by a lot. I actually would have really preferred if the book had ended with Holly grabbing the apple and that's the end, fade to black.
mhm.
And kind of left things ambiguous, or even not even with Holly grabbing the apple, but the conversation between Marinus and Hugo. I really enjoyed that conversation, and it had the book ended right there on this kind of air of mystery. That for me was a very good ending. The ending, though, to me was so depressing that I was just like,
I
I felt exhausted.
I I'll tell you why I love it so much. Um, every piece of work that I consider to be great deals with mortality, and I think Holly had like we had to see Holly die, and I knew as soon as she had cancer in Crispen's section, I was like, she's going to die in this story, and it's also a stark contrast of Holly versus the anchorites and the magical people because she chooses death essentially by sending her kids to I think it's Ireland.
It's
Um,
Iceland. They're in
Iceland.
Ireland. Yeah.
That's right. They're in Ireland, sends them to Iceland. So she, instead of almost, starting a new life or, preying upon these kids' opportunity to take herself, she gives them life. And to the magical beings that have had these powers, they take life. And she also doesn't have the exact like skills and abilities that they do. So Holly just happens to be some like a human that is spectacular, even though
Yeah.
there are deity type things out there. But the human still has like some sort of power in that. And maybe that selflessness of Holly is what the message is of the book. And I don't know. I really liked it. Also, I got to say this. I loved the scenario. Like when he's talking about how like the governments are like setting up like exchanges between the citizens and stuff like it's like what 2040 or something like that.
2047, I
Yeah.
think.
And
Yeah.
you have basically a big climate change issue and I find that stuff to be fascinating. It's almost like it's not quite post-apocalyptic. It's almost like during
Yeah.
apocalyptic or like the boring beginning stages almost. But I loved all that. So like I was just interested to see him write in that setting. But it was for me, Holly giving the children life rather than trying to
Yeah.
continue to hold on to her own.
I
That
never
that
thought
was
about
really
it like that.
That's why I felt like it was bittersweet, but maybe leaning
Mhm.
more towards the sweet because it was like her gift. Yeah.
And this whole story has been happening over time periods in different places, and
Mhm.
you get the sense that the world's moving on, and it's only for me, it only feels correct that this story obviously goes on beyond Holly. Right. I'm also
Yeah.
wondering if those kids show up in any of the other books. That's
Yeah,
what I'm kind of curious about.
I'm curious about that too. I mean,
Yeah.
I think for me the big thing was that I don't mind there being mystery at the end of a story that is so mysterious the whole way through. Because really, up until that Marinus chapter, I found the book to be quite mysterious because you're just getting those very small snippets of what this
Yeah.
war people group are. So for me, it was like you have Marinus, who's this ancient being, and you have Hugo, who's not ancient, but this weird species now. And they're kind of just having this talk about existence and giving Holly that gift. Like that for me was the interesting concept where it was like you have Hugo, who's this character who's so self centered and narcissistic, and gives that gift to Holly. And
Hmm.
I was like, oh, that's an interesting ending for Hugo and Marinus, where it's like these two groups kind of come together for the sake of one person. But I do like both of your perspectives, where it's Holly that's kind of offering this gift rather than taking this gift for herself. But just the ending itself, like about her daughter and stuff, I was like, no, like there's been enough terrible stuff to Holly. Enough.
Yeah, my God. I mean, it really was very hard hitting. I kind of like what Daniel says, gotta have a good scouring of the Shire at the end. Maybe that is his tipping of the hat to the fantasy genre. Like, 'cause Mitchell loves fantasy, by the way. Like he does. I love that he embraces it as well, and that's probably why he's the #1 Booker listed author that's never won. Like if he just wrote a contemporary fiction, he'd probably win the Booker, but he refuses to like not just throw in magic shit, which is cool. But yeah, I mean, it is super bitter, sweet.
It's interesting too, right? Because her mom is Irish. That's the connection to Ireland. And then in the end, she ends up in her mom's homeland, whereas in the beginning, she was running away from her mother.
Oh,
so
beautiful.
It's a very
full
circle thing. So I mean, I liked that aspect of it. There were parts about the ending that were very beautiful and of course very sad. So I'm not fully there on the ending. Like I like it a little bit more based on what you guys just said, but still for me, it's the weakest part of the book. But still overall, I gave the book a 4.25 out of 5. So a pretty
you gave it 3 out of 3 stars on Goodreads on Instagram.
No, that was a different book.
Was it? Because I remember I messaged you and I was like,
give it 3 stars?
I think you gave it 3 stars because I messaged you.
I was like, because I rated it 4.25 stars on Goodreads.
That's so funny because I messaged you whenever you post a story and I was like, well, this is sad. Like, dang.
No, that's why I was like, it's really not that bad, but okay.
Oh,
so no.
I was like, oh my gosh.
I felt like you had a lot of positive things to say, like when we talked about it.
Yeah.
And then when I gave you the 3, I was like, oh, maybe she disliked it more than I realized. That's so funny.
I thought you really didn't like it.
Typo. So it was a 4.25. I downed it to 4 on Goodreads because they don't let you do points.
It's so funny. I literally was at the end of this conversation be like, Laura, for a book that you didn't like that much, you got a lot out of this.
Yeah.
But it turns out you did like it.
Yeah, I did.
That's hilarious.
I thought there were parts of the book initially when I went into it. I was like, this is super weird. Now I don't really know what I'm getting into here. And then at the end, I felt a little let down. I'm not going to lie. Like the ending for me, I felt despair. And I was just, I felt so sad at the end. And I'm okay with a sad ending. It's just, I felt like for one singular character, I was like, this is a lot of loss, and of course it's from her perspective, it's over the course of a lifetime. But for me as the reader, I'm like, this is a very condensed period of time that Holly is experiencing all of these things. So to me, it kind of just felt, it felt like a mountain that I was going up with Holly. And I was just like, we're pushing this boulder up this mountain.
It's really
Holly.
Interesting too, that you brought up the fact that she ends up at her mother's home or she ends up in Ireland. And there's maybe something to the fact that at the beginning of the story, Holly and Jacko disappear, and at the end, she's letting go of her granddaughter and I guess her adopted son.
Yeah.
I thought it was it's pretty sad. It was sad, but I thought that was a beautiful ending. Honestly, I think it is. It did feel very unsettling about the possibility of something like that happening.
Yeah,
Well,
I thought it was pretty powerful when they were talking about like,
there.
Oh yeah,
what was that?
Go ahead. I think there's a message there, but I'll talk about it after you're done.
Oh, I would love to hear about that because the one part that stuck out with that whole entire scene was about. I mean, there was a lot obviously there, a lot of threat, a possibility of losing power and everything.
The internet.
But how they were talking about how the generation past didn't consider that all their data and all their photographs were online, losing all their photographs, like, and how that would affect your sense of personal history.
Oh yeah.
Like that was wild to me because I'm the worst about keeping like photographs, at least over the last couple of decades.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was pretty intense.
So you have this big battle, magical battle. You have Holly, who's almost like a chosen one, almost. And at
With
the
her
end, she ends up. Yeah, she's got a rolling pin. I mean, she's just she's better than Frodo, in my opinion. But The boy will die because he can't get his insulin. Something we have readily available right now that some
Yes.
places charge thousands of dollars for. My dad has diabetes, and he has been living off of free samples from his doctor because he can't afford his insulin. All of these crazy things in this book, all this magical stuff, and we're going to let that kind of, you know what I mean? You see what I mean? Like, how fragile is the human life?
Mm-hmm.
And how quick and fleeting is that? And I also think Holly having the adopted son is a really big thing, because it shows that, like, just because someone isn't your blood relative, like, you can still care for them. I think and that's why I said I almost felt a little bit optimistic, because I felt a sense of duty to do better at the end of the story, because that future that he depicts and then puts our characters that we cared so much about through. Well, Holly Sykes could be our grandchildren. It could be our best friend's children in generations. And we have to do better. We just simply have to do better and think about the rest of the world. And that is what I took from that final ending. And I mean, I remember when I closed the book, I got chills from it. I mean, it really made me want to be better.
Well, and
Mhm.
it's beautiful that you say that too, because you saying that is also reminding me of Ed. Because Ed, yes, he wanted to be with his daughter and with Holly, but he couldn't help but think of all the like Nazir and
Mhm.
Aziz, they had children too. And what about all the other children
Yeah.
and out there that he was putting them before his own in
Mhm.
some ways. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
it is, I feel like there is kind of an underlying message of thinking beyond yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That final chapter with the internet going out, I sat back and thought, like, I live in a different country from my family. Like, that's
Yeah.
my connection to my family is the internet. And then, like, the medicine, I'm on a daily medication. It's
Yep.
like, what happens if that stuff isn't just there?
Yep.
Because you just assume it's going to be there. So, yeah, it did feel post-apocalyptic in that way, but
Yeah.
also real time, because, like, with the scene with them coming and taking the solar panels and stuff, you're like, oh, this is currently happening,
Yeah.
but simultaneously also has already happened. So it was a very weird juxtaposition in terms of events,
Hmm.
but just devastating. Like, all of it was just so devastating.
Pulling from
Um,
a great possibility, yeah.
yeah, and then, like, for me, because I love religion so much, having that, like, that overarching theme of religion still being a thing in the end, where it's like she's not wanting her son to be in the religious program at school and stuff, and, like, the town is giving her a hard time. I'm like, "You all have bigger problems."
But that's the
Like,
thing. We can't seem to get out of our own way. I
No.
mean, we just
yeah,
can't. And
it's just it's
That's
human
such a that
nature
was a
to
good
its core.
commentary to throw in there.
Yeah,
yeah.
I
it's
thought that
just
was good, yeah.
human nature to its absolute core when you're just looking at someone being like, get it together. And they're like, or we could talk about this thing that doesn't really matter. And you're
That's
like,
right.
cool.
That's what we put
Yeah.
our energy into. I mean, I don't know. When you look at the scope of everything he tackles in this with I think really good intent, and well measured takes, I don't know, man. I thought this was incredible. I mean, what a
Yeah,
book. Uh,
masterpiece. So well
I
done.
liked it a lot more than apparently I told people. So
I was so confused. I
I
was
was
so
too.
confused.
I thought you were
yeah,
gonna
that was
DNF it
because
too,
I
because
paired it
I
with
thought
other
while you were
books.
reading it, you were very mid on it. Like, I
I
kept getting
was
that
mid
impression.
until I got to the Ed chapter. And then I messaged you and I said, I've changed my mind. And I didn't really say why. I was just like, I've changed my mind. And then when I got through Crispen, I was like, oh, Crispen. Like, I love Crispen so much. But I did really struggle with the Hugo chapter. I was interested in the first chapter very much with Holly. And then with Hugo, I was like I felt my blood pressure going up as I was listening to the audiobook, and I was just like, I don't know how much of this I can stomach because I actively want to kill him. Like, it was just so painful. But then the Ed chapter was so beautifully written and
Yeah.
so unique, really. I mean, that's the thing that when I finished the book, I said to my husband, I was like, listen, this was a very strange book. But I was like, but it's probably the best character voices I've ever read because
Yeah.
it was so individualistic and specific for each person that I've never quite experienced that with verbiage and with just actual use of language. It
Oh,
was so specific.
Brilliant.
he's a master with literary devices. I have heard Cloud Atlas is insane. And
Yeah.
I've heard that it's like almost him doing Olympic style literature. Like it's like he's
Yeah.
just doing everything, but it never is for the spectacle of look what I can do. He like makes it all work. And I think Cloud Atlas starts epistolary. I don't know if the whole thing, I guess he just does
I
everything.
think it is the whole thing. My understanding for Cloud Atlas is that like a character finds a letter of the previous character, and that's how it goes throughout
Oh,
the
I'm gonna
whole
love it.
book.
No, I'm gonna love
So,
it.
yeah.
I love epistolary usually
I might
too.
start it tonight. I might
Yeah.
start it tonight.
I mean, and it just is brilliant to me because, like, again, I mean, I know I'm echoing what I said at the beginning, but like as much as each character really does feel authentic to the time period in which they're written and the cultural influences and their socioeconomic status and their location on the globe and everything, they still feel like individual people at the same exact time. Like
Yeah.
they still feel like real people, like individual people. Like it's
Mhm.
amazing the way he's able to do that. And
Mhm.
also, he's good at I mean, all the other characters he brought into the story too
Oh, I mean,
are
Hugo's
incredible.
crew,
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
incredible.
They're
yeah.
all so awful. Like they're all individually terrible people, and as a collective, you're like the worst, but also great.
Dude, when Cheeseman is in jail, I was cheering for Crispen, by the way. I'm a terrible
Thank
person.
you.
I literally was
Same
like,
here.
good, let him rot. But when he went and visited him in prison, and it kind of like dawned on me like how messed up that is.
Yeah.
I was like, yeah, that'd probably eat me alive too. And that's the difference between Hugo and Crispen.
I thought that too. Yeah, they
Yeah.
both
And that's I just thought it
guilt
was such a good
conscience.
yeah, he's not a sociopath.
No.
I think Hugo is.
Yeah.
But I just I don't know. I love that scene. And then whenever he can almost kill him and then he doesn't kill Crispen,
Yeah.
only for Crispen to be killed by someone who is trying to make
Oh,
notoriety off his name, just like it's just like, oh man. What a
Crispin's whole
book.
thing from start to finish was for me, it was the most interesting because he was the most neurotic of all of our characters because he felt that like tortured artist where it did read that he's having this internal monologue, he's writing
Mhm.
his story, and then it's in interactions with the people around him. And his interactions changed drastically from his children, his ex-wife, Carmen,
Yep.
Polly, his publisher. Like he acts so different with every singular person that I was like, this is exhausting. Like Crispin is 100 different people in one
He's playing a
chapter.
different character and
That's
he's a
perfect for a
writer, so he's
writer.
like thinking like that.
Yeah,
Exactly.
Portrait
makes sense.
artist.
Exactly.
This is
So
a book.
fascinating.
Yeah, this is a book that I also think is just like antithetical to like the consumption that we do of books where we just try to get through it, find out what happens and move on. Like I
Yeah.
think this book definitely slowed me down in a good way. And I'm sitting here. So I had read this like what 2 weeks before I put out my top 10 books of the year. And Bone Clocks was going to be my number one book of the year, but I had to put in recency bias, so I ended up giving it to The Scarlet China Mieville. I'm not upset about that,
Yeah.
but now like being a couple months removed from it and then talking with you all and like really getting to discuss a lot of it, this is honestly probably one of the best books I've ever read. Like now that I'm really thinking about it, like when you think about its merits and its value, like there's some things I wish maybe could have been done a little bit differently.
Yeah.
But I mean, when you look at what this is, I just think that this is what at its maximum potential, like what like books can be. I mean,
Mhm.
It's
I love
brilliant.
this book. Like, wow.
I mean,
I'm like realizing it again. Like I knew I
yeah.
loved it when I finished it, but then you don't
Mhm.
talk about it. You wonder. I read a lot of criticisms of the book because if you look on Goodreads, all of his books are like 3.5 stars.
Yeah, it's very mid for most of his books. It seems like he is a very polarizing
Yeah.
character. He's a very polarizing author, and that you get either kind of like me in the beginning of this journey where you're caught up in being like, what is this?
Mhm.
Or you then kind of catch up and you're like, oh, I'm just gonna trust him and trust this process and
Yeah.
see where it goes because it is such a genre bending book. And
Yeah.
I think that can be really off-putting for people who aren't necessarily comfortable reading outside of their preferred genre or
Yeah.
trying something experimental because in many ways it does feel experimental to me. Um Because I can't say I've read anything like it. Like if someone were to say to me, pick something that's akin to the Bone Clocks, I would say nothing.
That's what I'm
Like I
saying.
don't
You'll never
really
get another experience quite like this. I mean,
yeah, it's
No,
I've heard his
so
no.
other books are I mean, I know is it the Thousand Autumns is like I think it's in Japan,
yeah.
and people say, like people who live in Japan say it's incredible.
Mhm.
So I'm just so excited to see him continue to use this method of vignettes because a lot of it's supposed to be like, glimpses. I
Mhm.
want to see more. And the people I know who read a lot of Mitchell, I don't think Bone Clocks is their favorite. Like I don't know if I know anyone that
No.
Bone Clocks is their absolute favorite.
The
There's
autumn one you just said has been the one that I have seen most well regarded by people
Yeah,
as their
Black Swan Green, Thousand Autumns, and then Cloud Atlas.
Cloud
And then
Atlas.
I
Yeah.
go
hear
through it
about
and look
Cloud
and see.
Atlas, yeah.
Yeah, Cloud Atlas is one of the only 4 movies Tom Hanks said he's only made 4 good movies, and Cloud Atlas is one of the ones he lists.
I need to know what the other 3 are.
Oh, it's
Yeah.
something weird. It's weird, I'm pretty sure, like, because people don't agree that Cloud Atlas should be on there because, like, it's a
No.
great movie, but, like, you know,
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I saw a lot about Cloud Atlas being people's favorites, and then Cloud Atlas gets into the post-apocalypse, so cool.
someone had it in here earlier, like way up. They said that I think maybe it was Bone Clocks or Cloud Atlas was number 9 on New York Times, like greatest science fiction fantasy books of all time.
Hmm.
I thought I saw a number 9 here somewhere earlier too. I'm trying to scroll up and see if I can find
I
it
never
now.
There's
thought about, so you all talked about the sci-fi aspect of it. I never really thought of it as sci-fi, but I guess maybe the
oh yeah.
futuristic part of it would
Oh
be.
yeah, and you get the sense that
Yeah.
there's more out there. I mean, it's
Yes.
like beyond Earth and stuff. That
Yeah.
doesn't surprise me though, because Le Guin does this in her works, and I know that he loves her. So like, uh, when I read Left Hand of Darkness, I was like, "Is this a sci-fi book?" Because there's so much world building, and it's a different world, but
Yeah.
like, it felt like fantasy at times too. And so you get this like weird, kind of culmination of those two things. I'll be honest, most of my favorite work cross those lines.
Oh, yeah. I was
Book
just
of
talking
Kings
about this with a friend today. It seemed, well, especially a lot of early sci-fi blends with fantasy like crazy too.
Oh
So,
yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
there's
What
just
is sci-fi
crazy.
if not fantasy in space? Like really?
Yeah, we're way more hardcore about like the divisions now. I mean,
Yeah.
I know some old heads though that like sci-fi or fantasy, you know what I mean? It's like one or the other, but I don't know. I like rule breakers,
I
and
do.
Yeah.
Me
Mitchell is
too.
a rule breaker.
Oh,
Yeah.
100%. For
Yeah.
me, I before we kind of realized that the script writers basically were sort of human. That's where I thought the sci-fi came in. I was like, are they human? Like I didn't know if this was going to be an external force kind of coming in, and then as the story was progressing, I was like, oh, it almost seems more religion
Mhm.
based and more human centered, so maybe less
Mm.
sci-fi. But that
Yeah.
really didn't click in until the end of Hugo's chapter for me. I was like, oh, I think this is just a group of people. Especially when he gets taken to that temple with like the monks and stuff like
Yeah.
that. So
Well, I mean, there definitely are, like, especially in that last chapter, like, not only futuristic implications for what is happening, like you were talking
mm,
about environmental themes,
yeah.
certainly a
But
lot to be said
if
there.
if you want more and like you don't want to commit to like Cloud Atlas, Slate House is like 300 pages, I think, or 280 pages. And it'll play into some of the stuff we talked about today and ties into Bone Clocks. And I really liked it. Just to give you an idea, Slade House is basically like think about the Hogwarts Express, how you have to like run through a pillar. It's like this alley that a door sometimes shows up and it goes into a house
Oh,
and people
cool.
end up there. And it's like, yeah,
Interesting.
I love that. I love the idea of like
Yeah,
a hidden door. It's always
Yeah.
like it's just something I love. Actually, I'm not a huge Harry Potter fan at all, but that's like my favorite part of Harry Potter is like the
like
idea.
portals?
Yeah, yeah, I love that. Or like whenever like I don't even know what story it was, but I remember watching a movie back in the day where like they had like underground tunnel houses through trees. So you like open up, like knock on this tree, it open. I don't even know what it was.
I'm
You know
getting
what I'm talking
weird
about?
flashbacks to that. And
It's something
yes.
big. I just don't
Yeah.
remember what it is, but it's like one of these childhood memories I have, and I remember that being the moment where I was like, "I think I really like fantasy," because
Yay.
it was some sort of fantasy story. I don't remember what it was.
Yeah.
Sounds familiar.
That's gonna bother me now because I'm getting pictures showing up in my brain. I'm like, that's a thing. So
Yeah.
More people should
But
do more houses and trees. That's all I'm asking for.
or
But
tree houses.
Slate House
Combine
is
them.
very short, and it's also
Yeah.
really good on audio. I did that one on audio. So
Okay,
Wait,
that's
how's
cool to know.
okay.
I did both for Bone Clocks. I would
same.
go in and out of the text, and then I did the last two sections completely on audio.
Mhm.
Because I really liked the voice for Marinus. So I
Yeah,
was
the
like,
narrator was very
here.
talented, I thought, for the audiobook. I did a lot of it immersion, which,
Okay.
by the way, Hugo's section on the audio, like, just the way, like, he gets that little snide, like, shithead vibe in the
Mhm.
narration, and
Well, it was different people. It was almost like the
yeah,
dramatized
it's like an
version.
ensemble of characters.
Yeah, which
Yeah,
was so interesting because that's the only way I feel like this could have been done in audiobook form because the voices of the story are so distinctive. I was like, you could not have had the same person narrating
it
all
adds so
6
much to
parts.
it.
The
Yeah,
only
Yeah.
thing for me, though, was the difference between young Holly and older Holly, and
That
yes,
was it.
voices do change, girls' voices do go through puberty,
Yeah.
but at the same time, it didn't quite it was very different for me, but I still
I
loved
agree.
it. I still thought it
I
was
thought
excellent.
they would actually have the same person for Holly at the end of the book. I was surprised it was somebody different. I was like, "Oh,
I didn't
that's the
listen
choice."
to any of her first chapter on audio. I read the whole thing physical, and then I have the
Okay.
audiobook, so I actually didn't know that. That's
Yeah.
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
different
So
narrator,
they
Hmm.
made a
which you
deliberate
probably did the right thing. I kind of wish I had gone that route, honestly,
I
but
do that with most books, honestly, unless if it's just like straight contemporary fiction. I have to like get in, know the
Mhm.
words and stuff for like world building purposes or locations, and then I can do audio. I struggle whenever I just start a fantasy book straight up on audio most of
yeah.
the time.
Yeah.
I
I
immersion
did
read
the
this
first
one.
3 quarters of Holly's chapter in physical, and then I switched to the audio because Joanna told me, she's like, "Oh, it's free on Audible." I
Free
was
on
like, "Oh,
Audible. Yeah.
excellent."
Yeah,
So, I
what a
ended
deal.
up doing that, but, yeah, I agree. If you're entering especially because like, a lot of so much of these characters are based on where they're from, and
Mhm.
I want to know those names
Yep.
specifically so you get to know the character on a more intimate level in that way. But yeah, a really interesting experience. I'm sorry I led everyone to believe that I hated this book, because I didn't.
I was really surprised. I was convinced you were gonna DNF it. I was like, "She's
No,
gonna
I
DNF
committed.
it."
I was like, I agreed to a buddy read. I will not DNF this book. And
I'm glad you
I,
didn't.
yeah, I'm very
Yeah.
happy I didn't. Honestly, I typically will give a book like a few hundred pages. I just DNF'd for the first time ever this year, and that was the whole thing. And I DNF'd one at almost 50%. So like, I'm generally a pretty solid committer of books, but really getting through to that end portion of Hugo's chapter, I was so interested with the interaction that he had with Constantine. And then Ed's chapter just sucked me so far down the rabbit hole that I was like, I'm here. Just
Yeah.
guide me. I'm here for this
That's
because it
like
was
one of the risk, right, of doing this type of format is like one of them could be like the most outstanding thing you've ever read, and then it's really hard to live up to that, you know.
yeah.
The fact that Crispin followed and that and delivered was crazy to me. And the
Mhm.
only way it works, I think, in that scenario is because of how different the voices were.
Yes.
Which is why I just kind of disagreed with that. The one article I read, I think it was the Atlantic, where they said that was the only blemish on the book. I was like, no, that's why it worked because it was so different.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's impressive to me that I had such a good time with so many different people
Yeah.
over
I
decades.
Yeah.
it was such a unique thing, and Joanna and I talked about it a little bit on Discord when we started the book. She was like, Holly's voice is in the first chapter is so specific to her time period and to her location, and just watching the evolution of language
Mm,
throughout the course of the book was so fascinating because when you got to the 2000s, you're starting to see words creeping into the vocabulary and vernacular, and you're like, oh yeah.
hmm.
Like,
Yeah.
that's when that started to be used and was a thing, and you just don't really think about language in terms of evolution in such a condensed period of time. We think about it in terms of, like, old Shakespearean English and our
Yes.
modern English, not really what a few decades can do. And I thought that was so fascinating too, just because you're not only using language to articulate class and geographical region, but like what is being introduced at the time, like cell phones,
Yeah.
and like stuff like that. Like when Crispin starts talking about his phone, you're like, oh yeah, we now have the iPhone. Or,
Yeah.
we now have that. It's like, it was just so weird because in terms of fantasy, that's not normally what we're dealing with. Like I'm not a big urban fantasy reader. So
Mm.
for me, I'm not typically exposed to that in a fantasy setting. I'm like, no one knows what a phone is. And then to just hear that kind of language, you're like, oh yeah. And I just thought that that was such a minor part of the story, but also so fascinating to me as to how that impacted how I viewed the characters. It was
Another
just
author
really
who's
cool.
really good at that, in my opinion, is Stephen King. I think
Mhm.
he's really good at that. Like in 11/22/63 or anytime
Yeah.
he writes, yeah, he's really good at capturing a voice from a specific time period and making it
Mhm.
feel really authentic.
Yeah. I
Yeah,
would I would imagine it has a lot to do with one experience, but also being in a field that has been so affected by
sure.
technology and the iPhone and e-readers and digital and audio and everything else.
Yeah,
So maybe it's more near and dear to them in those advancements than we would consider.
Yeah.
maybe. And it's interesting too when you think about it in that context that it's Crispin, right? That's dealing with that
Yeah.
introduction of technology, that it's the
Yes.
writer. So that's just another layer and nuance to the Crispin character that you're like, oh yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
I
and I
loved
think
it. And for me, I got a lot of nostalgia with the '80s stuff because
Mm,
especially as Holly is one of, 4 siblings, I'm one of 4 siblings, so it just like, I have 2 brothers and 1 sister like she did, so I felt a connection with her
Mm.
whole
that's
storyline from
awesome.
beginning to the
Yeah, and I'm
last.
like Hugo, so I had a big connection with Hugo. No, I'm just kidding.
Oh,
I mean,
dear.
my connection was to Crispin through Montreal and Outremont and all of his
Mm.
French Canadian family because I too have French Canadian family. So I really just I it was so weird. I've never ever read a book that had that for
And
me.
by the
And
way, speaking of French connection, what did you think about Holly pretending to be French in the Hugo chapter?
so funny. Oh my gosh. So
I
She's
funny
forgot
because
about
awesome.
that.
I love that.
I used to, so Montreal is a very multilingual city and you're expected to know French and English. So you can't like pretend really that you don't know one of those two languages. So it is so common in Montreal that you feign that you just don't know either language and that you're like a new immigrant to the city. And I was like, I'm living for this, Holly. Like, I love this for you because I used to see women doing this all the time in the subway station because my university was right on top of the metro and I would go down every day to take it and I would see these guys like hitting on girls and them just pretending to not know the language and then as soon as they would leave they would start talking to their friend in English and I was like perfection. So
That's
I loved
awesome.
it. I thought it
I
was
loved
super
it that
fun.
Holly did that to him too, because he always had the one up on every girl up
Yes.
until that point. And so it was just perfect. And it was perfect given Holly's past, that it
Yeah.
makes sense that she wasn't going to let him trick her into whatever. Like
Yeah.
she was smarter than him. So
Yeah. So
love
obviously this is a 5-star read, I assume, for Jimmy, or like close to a 5-star read. You're like a 9.5, you said, I think.
Yeah, but honestly, this is one of those things where it's like, should I really like for everything that we talked about tonight, like, is it not just a damn near perfect read? Like, I don't
Yeah.
know. It's so
What
hard to put my finger on it. I mean, a
I
lot of
know.
books are better with discussion, but
Mhm.
like I just knew when I finished this that this was like a special book, one that I wanted to talk about. It's a little intimidating also because it's so much.
Mhm.
Uh, but I mean, this has to be one of the best books I've read. I mean, it really has to be.
And Joanna, I know you don't Joanna who hates star ratings.
I don't because it's just too
Oh.
confusing, but, for me personally, but I have to say I love this book. I think it's up there as one of my favorite books of the year. I think The Dispossessed is still my favorite book of the year so far. I haven't gotten
Mhm.
that many reads in so far this year, but I think The Dispossessed might still be my favorite, but this one actually got more emotions out of me than The Dispossessed in some ways. Like I cried.
Yeah.
I cried reading this book
Yeah.
and I laughed out loud. And yeah, it just hit on so many levels. And I was very excited to talk about it. So thank you,
Mhm.
Laura, for hosting this because
Oh,
there were
anytime.
so many things I wanted to talk about that were specifically spoilers that I know I couldn't do in a spoiler-free way on my
Yeah.
channel.
Yeah.
No, this is a book that to really convey what it is, you have to get into the minutia of it because it's so character driven.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things that I feel like we're starting to see a little bit more of in fantasy, right? Where we obviously have our great epic fantasies that are very plot driven, and we're getting into this really interesting middle ground where we're starting to see stories that are much more character driven. And I know that this book, I think, was published in 2014. So it's close to a decade old, but it's interesting to me that we have books like this now that are kind of starting to come onto the scene that are under that fantasy genre, but
Mhm.
just really character books. And I think what you said is so true, Joanna, in that I can't really remember another book that I evoked so many different emotions from me in one
Yes.
singular book, right? Because like with Holly in the beginning, it's that intrigue and you're like, okay, where is this going?
Mhm.
Hugo, you just want to set him on fire because he's the absolute worst and you're just full of rage. And like, I was so angry reading Hugo. And I don't think I've been that angry reading about a character in a really long time to
Yeah.
then go to pure heartbreak with Ed. Like, it was just such a
The
big
range
switch.
is insane. I mean,
Huge
he's
Yeah.
range. Mhm.
multifaceted writer. He's not a one-trick pony.
No.
It's just I don't know. I might go back and reread just certain sections of this book in my lifetime. Like I might just go pop in and see what old Crispen's up to. Like I might do that. And you should. That's
Kristen,
special.
Kristen,
Cool.
he's having a good
Yeah.
time in Shanghai and then other
I love
parts of
that.
Colombia.
Yeah.
I know
It
that there's
was
something
interesting, by the way, that we ended his section in 2020.
Mhm.
And I'm
Yeah.
like, "You did not take that flight, but okay."
Yeah, right.
No.
Well, I
Yeah.
should say this. I guess I got corrected by this from a Super Mitchell fan named Fallen Adam, he's been asking me to read these for years. He's so relieved I finally read one, but he let me know this is not our world. It's supposedly like an alternate our world. So not a
Oh,
one for one. There are little things
I
that are
didn't
different.
know that.
And I
I
guess it's
didn't either.
more obvious in some of the other works, where he messes with that, or maybe it's a safe net for himself.
Sure.
Because you know it wouldn't age as well whenever 2020
Yeah.
one
Not
of the
so much
most
when there's
important years.
a
Yeah,
global pandemic. But I mean, you could have
yeah,
argued that the pandemic was brought on from the loss of Crispin in her
I
world. Because
agree.
really, what a loss that is.
And what was the 2020 year? Was that around our year? 2025. So it deals
Yeah.
with next year.
And then
Yeah. Which
2043, I think, is the last bit.
Yeah.
I think it was like 2043 or 20. Yeah, I think 2043 or 2047. I think it's 43 though. I think you're correct. But so weird, right? Because I mean, I was born in 1990, so for me, like I didn't
Me too.
have the 80s. So it was interesting to just kind of look at that as a fun, this is what I missed. And
Mhm.
then the rest was a remembrance and then what's potentially on the horizon. Like it's a really interesting retrospective and then also
Futuristic.
like looking forward, right? It's just it takes you through a whole journey in terms of that entire experience, which
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
again, like most books don't really do that.
Well,
It's very
yeah. I
much
mean, time travel happens to be one of my favorite subgenres, if that's what
yeah.
it's called, of
I'm with you.
sci-fi.
I'm with
I
you.
I
yes.
like a
Oh,
good time
I
travel
love it.
story.
I love it.
You were like, I'm tired of
1122.
time travel. I'm like, I'm not.
I
No,
love it.
I'm
Time
I'm
travel
game
is one
for
of my
time travel
favorites.
whenever.
Yeah.
So,
It's
Do you
so
like
fun.
time travel, Laura?
mhm.
Kindred, 112263. I mean, I love time travel.
Here's one we should
Timeline.
read, not to get completely off, but we should read the Doomsday Book by
Oh,
Connie Willis.
yes! Oh,
I would
I'm
read that.
down.
She has
I've been
won
wanting
so
to
many
read that by
awards.
Connie Willis.
I've read
Yes.
the first 2 chapters. It's a good start. Very, very good
What?
start. And Laura, you would love it.
I would
You
read it.
Oh,
You're a
let's
history
do
person.
it.
You
Let's
would love
I'm
it.
in. I'm in. I'm actually surprising myself because I usually say I do not like dystopian and I don't like post-apocalyptic. I used to say that to myself. I think I'm wrong. I actually really liked
It's my
Lost.
favorite.
Well, I'm reading this, which you read last month, and
What am I looking
it's
at?
High
really
I'm
sci-fi.
not that
disturbing. It's so
okay.
disturbing, though. It's so disturbing, but it's actually kinda reminds me of the Bone Clocks, like the last chapter, but it's
Yeah, a
way
little
more
bit.
surreal. It's really surreal, very dreamlike, and it's very disturbing,
I
but
have
it's
weird
really
things
good.
with dystopian because it's like watching a horror or a thriller. I'm like, that could happen, and
Yeah,
I
I
get
mean,
like
it's
really nervous.
allegorical. It's like
Yeah.
allegorical, for climate change, for
Mhm.
all the horrible things that we're probably doing to our planet and the
Right.
possibilities at hand, and it kinda goes into a similar sort of scenario where it's like the military everything's military run. The government
Sure.
becomes really dependent on the military rationing things, and then people are at war and fighting on the streets, like, it's a mess. It's a
Yeah.
mess, and then it's also allegorical for abuse, especially of a woman,
Mhm.
so
And
it's
obsession.
yeah,
Very
it's
much
it's
obsession.
very
Well, Cloud
disturbing.
Atlas is supposed to be post-apocalyptic,
Mm.
which I
I
did
might
not
have changed my
expect.
mind. I don't know, I might like it. I
Yeah,
might
I
like
didn't
it.
Yeah,
expect. But apparently it deals with that at least in one of the sections. And I think someone even said earlier that we might get a little more information about the world from Bone Clocks in Cloud Atlas and what happened in
I
that.
Oh.
read that. So when I
That's
was doing my little Reddit deep dive, I avoided all spoilers for other books, but people were very much saying that Cloud Atlas gives context for
mm,
Bone Clocks.
that's my next
So
one. I can't wait.
So
I'm
I'll
excited.
be honest, like I don't usually do this for any book, but because they were mentioning terms that were recurring and I was having a hard time remembering it, I did look up like one of the terms, like suasion, I think. And then I found this little key for what's called a psychosoterica, which is the basic system that he's using. So I
Yeah.
actually have a list of these specific, like telepathy, obviously, and like what is it called? Hiatus, redaction,
Mm,
scansion,
mhm,
suasion, dream seed, transversion, kinetic, transubstantiation, and cloaking. Like there are specific terms, and I'm guessing that those are common to his universe. So
yeah.
I have a
I
little
think
key that I made
so.
myself.
There's also a
Yeah.
map online of where Holly walked in her first chapter. Someone plotted it on Google Maps and it says Holly Sykes Adventure because all the
Wow.
And
places are real. Yeah, pretty cool.
That's so
they
neat.
did that. They did that in All the Pretty Horses and The Crossing. I love that. I love
Oh,
it when
that's
people do
cool.
that. Yeah,
Yeah,
because there are actually places, like I said, where my dad grew up that are referenced in those books. So I
yeah,
got
that's
excited.
That
very
Yeah.
cool.
That's
Mhm.
the thing. As soon as I mean, I didn't doubt it with the previous chapters, but as soon as I got to Crispen's and he was naming places that I knew, I was like, "Oh, he knows." You know?
Yeah,
It's just like it's like he's been there, you know? And I mean, when Crispen is in Colombia and then Shanghai, I was like, how much research for Crispen alone did he do in terms of locations? And then Australia, like there was just so many differing places. And I was like, this is one chapter of this book. Like,
yeah,
not one chapter, but like one POV.
yep.
So
And
it's wild.
even yeah, even New Mexico is mentioned in the book. I got excited
Yep.
about that. Yeah,
I thought
there's a
that when
lot.
I got there, I was like, oh, Joanna. Yeah. But
Wonderful. What that this has been such a wonderful discussion. I am so glad that you hosted this so much, Laura, and I'm so glid you
Yeah,
enjoyed it. So thank
I
you.
yeah.
yes, I'm very sorry to the 6 people that care that I mislabeled this book.
It's
Because
so funny.
I posted it with 2 other books that I gave 3 stars. So I guess in my brain I was just like 333, but in reality it was 4.2533. So
I might make a
sorry.
Bone Clocks review video. I
Do
might.
it.
We'll
You
see.
Yes.
should. I mean,
Please
your
do.
competition is the 9-year-old videos.
Yeah.
I'm like,
Your
Think of
coming
all
up.
competitions.
think of all the tens of views I can get on that. Oh man.
This will be a good gauge when you look tomorrow and see that we have 17 views to
Yeah.
know that that is what you get.
This one was for us.
It
This
was
one was for us, really.
gosh. Yeah. Well, I'm really glad though. I mean, this has been a wonderful opportunity because I I've been thinking about this book since I finished it, and it's now been, I guess, a couple of weeks, but it still has stayed with me. I'm
Yeah,
still
I've been thinking
yeah,
about Hugo for
read it.
months. Like I'll never forget
Yeah.
Hugo.
I don't think I'm thinking so much about the characters as much as the impact of the ending. Like that's what has stuck
Hmm.
with me more so than anything else. I'm just like, oh, is that where we're heading? And it's a sadness, like
Mm.
it's a sadness because so much of that book I feel like is what a singular decision can impact, right? And it's like, and it starts with Holly running away, and then does that lead to Jacko, and then does that lead to this, to this, to this, to this, to this? And it's like, okay, can a singular decision of what I do impact that ending? Like, what
Yeah.
if everyone makes a singular decision like that kind of thing? So I
Can
think
we
that
can we unpack that again? Because I'm trying to remember. Did Jocko run away because Holly ran away? That
no.
so that's been verified, but Jacko would have been there was something about Miss Constantine would have used Jacko as she was using him as bait for Holly, except that Holly gave away Miss Constantine. So at some point, Holly actually becomes the hero. She actually, right? Am I
So
misunderstanding that?
Holly has this third eye, like master ability, and Miss Constantine like gleams onto that because she's a really good candidate to be eaten, basically. And Jacko, when he was, I think, 5 or 6 or 7, something along those ages, came down with scarlet fever, I believe
Right.
it was, and
That's when he
technically
changed.
dies. And
Yes.
then that's when he's taken over by one of the horologists. So from that point on, it kind of felt to me that Jacko was like almost a guardian for Holly. And then when Holly leaves, it's like, okay, well, I'm done. Like I'm being called back now.
Mm.
So he leaves to go rejoin the horologist because Holly has now closed off her third eye. Like she can't be
Oh, that's right,
accessed
because he was a
anymore.
horologist. They do
Yeah.
reveal that he was one of them.
Yeah. So my understanding was like his job almost is done and then he returns to his group, but he still has that affinity and affection for Holly, obviously, which is why he kind of returns to her and waits for her in the end.
Mhm.
Which was such a touching scene for me. Apparently, I'm giving a thumbs up to it being really like a touching scene. But because when you think about it in the grand scope of everything, right? Like he's this almost ancient being. And in terms of our lifespans, they're microscopic
Yeah.
compared to them, right? But Holly has stuck with him. Like he keeps waiting for Holly and he keeps going back for Holly. So that final scene where he and Marinus go retrieve the children and she's like, "Oh my god, it's you." And he's like, "Yep." To me was very very poignant where it's like they had this very special connection with each other, even though they couldn't have a lifetime of memories with each
Yeah.
other. It was just very, very sad, but very touching all at the same time.
That was one part of the plot that was a little tricky for me to
Yeah, I mean, a lot of
understand.
the magic stuff was muddy to me. Like, I
Yeah,
was like
it's a bit ambiguous.
honestly, I was thinking I'm gonna reread this probably, so I was like, "Whatever, like, it'll be fine." I just
Yeah.
I was there. I was like, "Let's get back to the when nothing was happening. Let's get back to that,"
Yeah.
which is a
Same.
hard pitch for a lot of genre readers,
I
whenever you
know.
say, "Oh, my camera focused on Bobby B. See this?"
He's like, "No, let's focus on me."
Right,
He's up
right?
there talking. But yeah, for genre readers, whenever you say, "Yeah, nothing really happens," like there's not a lot of action until page 600.
Yeah.
Might be a
Which I
tough
mean,
sale.
that's part of it too, is I think when we and I think it does a disservice to this book to pitch it as a fantasy book because you go in with expectations of it's going to meet these criteria of the genre and like magic systems are going to be explained or there's going to be like crazy world building or it's like going to be battles and all that kind of stuff and I was sitting there going like none of that is happening, so what are you?
Yeah.
And
I don't know, I don't really like the idea of fantasy being so confined, though. I
sure,
kind of like fantasy to not to have so many rules behind it personally.
I
Like, I love,
agree.
for example, Vita Nostra, and that's considered a much more magical realism. It's a
Mhm.
Russian-inspired fantasy, and then, like, somebody was talking about Murakami, for example, like the Wind
Yeah.
Up Bird Chronicle. That's much more
Mitchell
like,
gets compared to Murakami quite a bit because they're
yeah.
both in that magical realism, too good to be fantasy, for the snobs, and
Yeah.
then also not action packed. And you know what I mean? Like it's
Right.
in the contemporary fiction section. It
I
doesn't
think,
fall.
but
Yeah.
see, this is, I think, part, and I agree with you, Joanna, completely. I think this is part of the problem is that there has been this idea of these are what qualifies fantasy.
Yeah.
So, like, subconsciously in my brain, I was looking for specific things, and when they weren't happening, I was like,
Mm.
what what's going on?
Yeah.
Um, and really, it I agree. I think it is more magical realism if you're going to put it on that fantasy scale, but it definitely is fantasy because there are these fantastical elements that come into the story. It's just such a unique approach to
Mhm.
it. And I mean, like I said before, I really am not an urban fantasy reader. So for me, it was a very new experience in that regard. And I'd be curious when reading other urban fantasy to be like, how do I feel about this as a subgenre in
Try
general?
reading Stephen King. Try reading The Dark Tower. I think you would your
We'll
brain would
see.
explode.
Stephen King is not one that is typically on my to-do list. But all right. So I feel like everyone knows where you guys live on BookTube, but you can tell people where to find you.
Fantasy Network. That's it.
Joanna reads.
Yeah.
Hey,
Go read David Mitchell.
go
But
read
if you're
David
watching a
Mitchell,
2-hour
Bone
point, you probably have read David Mitchell. So.
If you're still here, you likely have.
Beautiful cover.
Such a
There
good
you go. So thank you both so much for having this conversation with me. Joanna, thank you for buddy reading it with me. It's our third buddy read and it was a success. So that's always good. I finished on time this time, which was very exciting for me. But all in all, really interesting read. Thank you for the suggestion, Jimmy. So good
I'm
stuff.
glad
all
that you both liked it. Thankfully.
Yeah.
Loved it.
Yes.
Yes.
All right, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Have a good night. And we'll see you next time.